I'm a long-time researcher and investigator, independent investigator, political investigator into the hidden government and hidden history, purposely hidden history, stolen history of the United States that has become a commodity of the national security state that has existed since late 1940s. And I want to put this in a broader context because I'm going down to the minutia, but I want to come back up to the broader picture because I think in the end that's what we need to be dealing with.
Hear ye! Hear ye! The court's in session. The court's in session. Now, here come the judge. Here come the judge.
Here come the judge.
Stop beating that fudge, 'cause here come the judge. Don't nobody budge, 'cause here come the judge.
I welcome this kind of examination.
I am paying for this microphone.
What difference does it make?
I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore.
I'm just a patsy.
Not a Pax Americana, enforced on the world by American weapons of war.
Wherever there's a cop beating up a guy, I'll be there.
We didn't land on Plymouth Rock. The rock was landed on us.
The United States is owned by foreign corporations. Do you really care? And if anybody cares, they're considered crazy.
I have sinned against you, my Lord.
Man, all the humanity and all
the controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction.
An unspeakable tragedy. Dead on arrival.
And I will go to my grave being at peace about it.
Our long national nightmare is over. Don't give up. Don't ever give up.
This is the Midnight Rider News Show with S.T. Patrick.
Hi, this is Randy Benson. You're listening to the Midnight Rider News Show with S.T. Patrick.
Hello, America and the world. Welcome to the Midnight Rider News Show. I'm S.T. Patrick, your friendly neighborhood host, traipsing through the trials and travails that have so tempestuously and untruthfully been blasted into your eyes, ears, and minds by the state-sponsored talking heads, court historians, and textbook conglomerates that control information today. Tonight we have episode 049, Randy Benson interviews John Judge. Now this is the third installment of the Midnight Rider News Legends series. Part 1 was Ralph Epperson on the JFK assassination, and in part 2 we heard from Seymour Hersh as he discussed his work uncovering the My Lai massacre story. So for those not aware, we're trying to take a look at researchers and work that has meant something to us. Now some of the researchers, like sadly John Judge, have passed on and some have not, but it's a chance to highlight an earlier presentation, a speech, or an interview that we did not conduct. So a paltry bit of castle cleaning before we introduce Randy and John. Now it's easiest to find us on the iPhone podcast app, on iTunes, or at our humble abode, midnightridernews.com. So go to the site and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And the links to all of those are on midnightridernews.com. And we're also on YouTube in limited form, if that's how you prefer your media to be gathered. We are there, so you can find us there. We're now on Spotify, and we will soon be on iHeartRadio as well. So we'll be right back with Randy Benson and John Judge. Who were the first researchers out of the box to question the Warren Commission's version of the JFK assassination? What obstacles did they have to face? How did their research bind them and inspire their work to this day? And just what did Randy Benson buy at the Last Hurrah bookstore? You won't believe it.
This is Randy Benson, director, producer, and writer of the documentary film The Searchers. To hear more about The Searchers, listen to episode 9 of the Midnight Rider News Show.
Randy Benson is an extremely talented documentarian who's made one of the most seminal films about JFK's assassination research. Now, his work, The Searchers, has been shown around the world and at many of the most important conferences taking place today. He's someone I like and respect very much, and I would also say that he's a friend. So he's kindly allowed us to use the complete footage of an interview that he conducted with John Judge for The Searchers. This interview runs under 3 hours, and we understand that you may not have time to listen in one setting, but believe me, you'll want to get through it at some point. Randy conducted this interview with John Judge on September 16th of 2007. The interview and so much more, a treasure trove of JFK assassination gold, really, can be found on the box set to The Searchers, which you can purchase from Randy at thesearchersfilm.com. Now, you absolutely need to own this box set, so please go to thesearchersfilm.com. That is thesearchersfilm.com. JohnJudge.com and order away. You will not regret it. Now, I'm going to let John explain who he is and what he does, as he does so well in this amazing interview. But sadly, we lost John in April of 2014. Yet his memory and his work will live on. So we'll have more on John Judge the man when we talk to Joe Green later in the month of April. But for now, enjoy the work of Randy Benson and John Judge.
I'm John Judge, and I've been an independent researcher and investigator and lecturer and writer over many years, and one of the main topics that I've looked into are political assassinations and covert operations, hidden history of the United States, especially in the post-World War II period. And I helped to found the Committee for an Open Archives with researcher Bill Kelly to try to get the files loose, and that was right after the, well, actually a little bit before the Stone film came out, JFK, Oliver Stone's film JFK, which called for release of the records at the end of the film, and started a groundswell that led eventually to the passage of the JFK Records Act. And I helped with getting that passed, and also with getting it implemented through a review board, independent review board that was created. And it's been one of the most successful record release vehicles to date. The Freedom of Information Act from 64 to 94 maybe got a few thousands of pages loose, but since the passage of the JFK Records Act in 92, and the board was finally created in 94 and went out of existence in 98, the archives and the different agencies have been forced to release over 6.5 million pages. The only thing that's outstripped that so far is the Nazi Criminal Records Act, based similarly with an independent review board, and that's gotten 8.5 million pages so far. But it's one of the largest record releases in history of the United States, and it's a model that we need to be using for the Martin Luther King assassination, for the 9/11 Commission records, and other things. So a coalition was formed with Committee for an Open Archives and the Assassination Archive Research Center, a group out in California that was committee to investigate the assassinations, CTKA I think it was called, but it was a citizens group to look into the Kennedy assassinations, and a network of hundreds of researchers that worked on the case called the Coalition on Political Assassinations, and I helped co-found that and directed it since 1994. So I started out my research on John F. Kennedy largely because I was shocked by the incident when I was 15 in high school. I remember coming home and someone was hawking papers yelling the president's been killed and the president's been shot, and I told him to shut up. And I was at a Catholic high school when it happened, and no, I wouldn't consider myself a devout Catholic. I liked Kennedy, just I didn't have a developed political sense, but I just liked him on a personal level. And I felt a sense of loss, and then also a sense that the movie completely reversed itself after he died, that the sense of hope that he carried for the nation and the things that he was striving for that were more universal and global and peace-oriented were then replaced by this endless war in Vietnam and the re-rise of them and consolidation of the military-industrial complex that Eisenhower warned about. I started with one of the critics' books about 67, I think. I read Mark Lane's Rush to Judgment, and that led me to feel that I should investigate the matter from the source, so I went to the 26 volumes. I was in college at the time, and I read all of the commission volumes. The report, I came here to the National Archives and read several hundred feet worth of documents that they had that were public, but they weren't part of the published report on the internal workings of the commission. And from doing that, I realized that there were a lot of errors. I worked with early critics and started to find their books. One of the first ones that I worked pretty thoroughly with was Penn Jones. I discovered the work of Mae Brussell about the time of the Watergate inquiries, and I found that she was going in some of the same directions I had, and she was among one of the earliest of the researchers. A lot of the early researchers were women. There was Lillian Castellano, who worked on the Robert Kennedy case. There was Maggie Fields. There was Sylvia Marr in New York. And so Mae became a mentor to me. She was indefatigable. She clipped 15 daily newspapers, 150 periodicals a month. She went through 300 to 500 books a month, and she'd break it all down every week into a radio show. And she had spent years, starting at the time of the Kennedy assassination. She got the volumes when they came out, and she cross-referenced indexed the volumes, 1,800 pages of cross-reference and reference indexing. So then she knew the characters, and she started following them through time and clipping and figuring out what was being done and how the subsequent assassinations related to the Kennedy assassination, the deaths of witnesses, which Penn Jones followed, and other breaking information of the case, but putting it within a broader historical context of covert operations and intelligence. I was studying some of that stuff because I also was looking at the history of the Vietnam War, starting in '64 when I came out to oppose the war. I was reading Bernard Fall. I always liked to read. I had access to the Pentagon Library because my parents worked in the Pentagon, as did my aunt, and when I was a kid they would take me in there and drop me off in the library because that's what I like to do. I didn't see classified materials, but I saw things that you wouldn't find in a regular bookstore or library out in the public. So I found that the things that I sort of got off Dealey Plaza. I mean, once I looked at the hard evidence, it was clear that there was more than one gunman. There were bullets coming from different directions. It wasn't so important to me where each bullet came from or who fired them, because I didn't feel that the gunman would lead you back. I figured they would be cutouts and probably not even themselves know who had hired them and who they were working for. But I felt that the patsy would be the way to go, that Oswald, the person that was set up and falsely blamed with the murder, if you could get into his background and figure out who he was and what was moving him, that would start to tell you whose hands were on this. And also looking at the destruction of evidence and killing of the witnesses and who were they and what might they have known, and who was destroying the evidence. So I started that way, and I started into the backgrounds and the history of the people on the commission itself. Allen Dulles, one of the early directors of the CIA, John Sherman Cooper, who had been a civilian director in Germany in the post-war period when they were moving the Nazis around, and John J. McCloy, who had been the first civilian governor in Germany and pardoned key Nazis and was a sort of unrepentant American proto-fascist. So they related to a hidden part of American history that had to do with bringing large numbers of German spies, especially spies under the Gehlen Network who spied on Russia, which we had no information about, into the United States, who became, and Bobby Inman, a later director, admitted this to me in a public forum, that those guys were basically the architects of the Cold War. They pitted the United States and the USSR against each other, locked us into a long period of militarization and deindustrialization, while our former enemies, the Nazi countries, were demilitarized and industrialized, so that by some point two little countries, Japan and Germany, became capitalist competitors with the United States. So I think you need to ask the question, who really won World War II? But Nazi scientists were brought over in large numbers as well. And then when you get into the details of who these Nazis were, who they worked with in the United States,
well, let's stay with
all of that. Tells you something about the history. So I've been doing that investigation, for some time, and then the Coalition on Political Assassinations sort of tracked the work of the Assassination Record Review Board and tried to get them to look in the right places for where the files would be, and put pressure on them to be as forthcoming as they could with the records. Well, I think maybe other people would rather be doing other things. I wouldn't. I like to read, I like to research, I like to look into things, and that's been a passion for me, even to the point that on weekends I'd make my parents take me to a public library before taking me out to play sports or something. So I already have that background, and I grew up in a community that was basically the bedroom community for the CIA, the NSA, the DIA, the NRO, the NASA, the whole alphabet soup of initials of the government spy agencies, the Pentagon employees, all were my neighbors. And that's the milieu I grew up in. And listening to them at their cocktail parties and their Christmas parties and when they talked among themselves, it became clear to me fairly early on that there were two governments operating, one that was visible and one that was not. And while they weren't spilling all of their secrets, it was enough that I understood, and could ask some questions and get answers that I wouldn't have gotten by reading a newspaper. I became sort of embarrassed into reading newspapers daily by a college roommate in my freshman year who would put me down if I didn't know who he was talking about. He said, well, how can you not know who that is? And so then I had to sort of make myself start reading newspapers. And I preferred reading to the television news. I picked it up. I stopped watching television in the 70s. I haven't gone back to it, except I did turn my TV on 9/11. Just to make sure whether I was going to survive or not, since I felt the plane hit and it shook the windows here. And I wasn't sure what the rest of the scenario was going to be. And when I did turn it on, they were going into continuity government. They were going into martial law. And they were clamping the whole city down. So I took my hard drives and some clothes and a few books and hightailed it out into Maryland and the burbs, and didn't come back till 2 or 3 in the morning when I thought things either would be locked down or would be clear. They were very close, I think, to really shutting the whole thing down. They kept Reagan Airport shut for quite some time afterwards. But I think it's partially that, and that it had an impact on me. The feeling, like I say, that the movie reversed, that something terribly wrong happened on November 22nd, 1963, that a country was lost in some profound way. And the more I read about Vietnam and covert operations and the history of all that, the more convinced I became that the seed of fascism was planted here at the end of World War II, if not before. Thomas Merton, who was also a friend of Penn Jones, the researcher I mentioned earlier, in 1936 said, if America fights Hitler, it will become Hitler. And I think he's prescient in that, although it's very hard for people to understand that you become your enemy, but you do. And the Cold War took us in probably the worst possible direction that we could have gone as a nation, and we're still not out of this permanent war economy. The neocons in charge now are trying to pull us into war that won't end in our lifetime, as Dick Cheney said, and that may involve as many as 60 countries. But that's not the kind of country I want to live in, or the kind of world I want to live in. And so to me it was a context also of an emerging consciousness of my own of what was wrong with militarism, what was wrong with war, how Kennedy actually tried to stop some of those things, end the arms race, and stop the nuclear testing, pull out of Vietnam, which he was in the process of doing, and normalize relations with Cuba, which garnered him many enemies, but the worst were the Joint Chiefs of Staff, I believe, who ultimately were behind and responsible for the planning of his assassination and the rise then through Johnson, who was in the pocket of George Brown of Brown and Root. You may have heard of Halliburton subsidiary Kellogg Brown and Root. That's the same company, although they broke off recently, making $4 billion on Vietnam and hundreds of billions on this war. But that profit motive drives a permanent war economy and leads us into many bad decisions. I think they were also killing hope, both with Kennedy and certainly with Dr. King. Part of the reason they killed Dr. King is he moved beyond civil rights and started to address the poverty issue and started to address the war in Vietnam. Robert Kennedy came back from his grief renewed and was striking some of those same themes, and was a threat to them because he could have and said he would reopen his brother's case once he got into the White House. So the same characters would reappear in my work, the same psychiatrists, the same forensic doctors, would be used in the different phony autopsies. The same agents would encircle people with connections were rife, and the patsies followed the same patterns. So it's kept me going, but I also have a commitment to ending secrecy and having a transparent and truly democratic society. And part of the way these assassinations are carried out and covered up is that we have a national security state that's made our history a commodity of that state and literally buried it out in Suitland, Maryland, not far from here. There are underground buildings holding just the military archives of the United States, and each one's an acre in size, and there's 27 of them. And that's just the military history since the end of World War II that they've buried. And when they take your history away, you're a conquered people. And they're in a higher geared secrecy modes in the Bush administration, especially since 9/11, than they were before. 15.7 million classifications in the last calendar year of records. That's not pages, that's records. So you can probably multiply by a factor of 10 to get an idea of how much is being covered up. Previously declassified records are being sought through all the archives and reclassified by this administration. And they've claimed basically a right to hide anything, to refuse to testify to anything, to claim executive privilege over almost everything they do, and hide behind this cloak and veil of secrecy. And so the efforts that I was making to get the JFK records loose were efforts within a broader context of having a transparent society, because Martin Schatz, one of the early critics, wrote to another critic, Vince Salandria, and he excerpts this in his book, History Will Not Absolve Us, and he says that the political paralysis in America is based on the fact that we're allowed to believe anything, but to know nothing. And when you cannot know, you cannot act. And so if we want to live in a democracy, we have to be able to know. It has to be an informed democracy. There isn't any other kind. You have to be able to know what's happened in order to make a decision on how to respond to it. Instead, we've got a Wurlitzer that poses as a media propaganda, mostly right-wing, and totally disinforming the public and omitting more than it lies about in terms of what really needs to be discussed. And that's more and more concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. So the flow of information through educational system, which is also manipulated through books, censorship, and even illiteracy. I mean, if you have a basically post-literate population, you don't have to have censorship of the materials. No one's going to read them anyway, as Alan Dulles said of the released 26 volumes. The 9/11 Commission remembered what we did, and so Zelikow and Keene, the director, and the chairman, locked up every single classified and non-classified record, interview, correspondence, document that they relied on for their final report till 2009. But it's January 2nd, the last days of the Bush administration, and he's likely to reverse the release and keep it secret even longer. But they handed it to him to do that by making that date the release date. But they basically handed us a Warren Commission report without any volumes. A book that footnotes for hundreds of pages in tiny print documents and interviews that supposedly back up their point, none of which the public can see. So it just gets more and more surreal as we go in terms of, and even the Commission volumes materials, which Hale Boggs insisted on releasing, don't tell the whole story, and weren't all the records, obviously. So we've gotten 6.5 million more records loose. We've gotten all the records that were locked up by the House Select Committee on Assassinations on JFK, as well as all the Warren Commission documents, which would still be secret had we not passed that bill, because Johnson locked their records up for 75 years, and the House Select Committee for 50 years. So we still wouldn't be seeing any of these things. And so all those things have kept me going, as well as working with the researchers and trying to build a community of the researchers and have an organization that's led by and for researchers and is about the serious end of doing the work, the scientific end, the forensic end, the historical end, and getting the best evidence forward, not just whatever crazy or salacious theory somebody has, but to really get what researchers are doing, even down to the individual researchers that's only working on one small aspect of the case. If they're doing valuable work, I want to put that work forward, and that's part of what COPA has been about since '94. Well, it's been expanding. I mean, there's a lot of younger people that were put onto the case by JFK film. And
can you elaborate on that a little more?
Well, there were an early group, I would say. I mean, in the day when I was starting my work, and I'm sort of version 1.5 of research. I mean, I wasn't the very earliest, but I came in the late 60s. And there was a core of, I don't know, maybe 15 people at that point who were serious working on the case, and as well as some planted critics, in my view, that were doing damage control.
Can you tell me who those were really quick?
Well, I think one of the worst was Mark Lane, who really, I mean, I started with his book and I liked him, but I think that he always delimited the case. He would never say who did it. He now blames the CIA, but never mentions the DIA or the Joint Chiefs. But I felt that he played basically a delimiting role, and didn't allow questions to be answered, was hostile to Mae Brussell and the other researchers that I knew that I felt were grassroots and were doing real work. And I saw him play roles to make sure they didn't speak at conferences, and vilifying them. So I was always a little wary of him, and then he became Jim Jones's lawyer, and he's currently Hinckley's lawyer, and he moves in and out of these cases constantly. But I thought that a lot of the early researchers were just independent, genuine people who had a concern and took to doing the work and did the work well and did it hard. But the case had pretty much died except for a core around those people. There were some conferences in the 70s and in the 80s. There was a conference at MIT at Cambridge that Carl Oglesby put on. There was a conference here in D.C. in the 10th anniversary that Bernard Fensterwald and Jim Lazar put on. What I always refer to as the spook conference, because I never saw so many intelligence people in my life in one room, even guys with eye patches and dragon lady girlfriends. And there was, and we know now from the documents, there was intelligence community infiltration and penetration, and basically a COINTELPRO operation against the researchers to discredit them, right from the start, and to try to back up the Warren Commission volumes and the phony conclusion, lest it go where it would go, looking at the real evidence. So I think, early on it was easier in that sense because there were only so many of us, and we worked together and shared things for the most part. There came over time to be contentions between some of the researchers, and people staked out their ground and held to it, and had fights with other ones. But there was a Midwest conference I remember sometime I guess that was in the 80s, out in Chicago, of researchers. And we had started COPA on the, I guess it was the 35th anniversary, at a meeting that was put together by, it was called JFK Assassination Symposium, ASK, and they, or I guess it was Assassination Symposium on JFK, but anyway, they called themselves ASK. That was a rock group promotion thing called South by Southwest, and for whatever sets of reasons, the people in Dallas, rather than organizing their own conference, brought these people in and had them organize it. The effect was that researchers had to get there on their own steam. They weren't paid anything for speaking. Their talks were not allowed to be taped as they were going. They would run out afterwards with the tape and sell it to you. They charged an outrageous amount of money to get into the conference. And when Bill Kelly and I approached them as press representatives, I was covering it for Pacifica Network, and Bill was a stringer for AP. They first took our credit cards, then pulled our press credentials and said that we weren't working press, and then billed us anyway and lied to the credit card company when we opposed it. I mean, these are people that if you lost your registration badge, you'd have to pay registration again, as if they had no record. and they told you that even your brochure about the events, it was $5 more if you misplaced it. So I held a meeting. I asked for a researchers meeting at the end of the last Ask conference, and I said, why are we doing this? We can put the money that we get from these conferences to our own use, and use it to work for the ends of the research community, not be monkeys on the grinder, box dancing so he gets the change. I mean, what's the point? So that's a lot of how COPA started, plus that the review board was coming into existence in '94, and we wanted to monitor it and work together on it. And
what year was the last Ask conference when you had that conversation?
What would have been the 35th anniversary? 63, 93, plus 5, 98. And then I think the Stone film comes out in 99, is it? Or maybe...
No,
Stone films were early,
91.
Like 89 or 91, yeah. So, we had that momentum, and, then we had conferences, a lot of them here in D.C., and there were probably 400 people at the first big conference we had in D.C., and we made arrangements to shuttle people up to the National Archives to look at the materials that were being released. We had members of the Assassination Record Review Board come and speak at the conferences. We visited their offices from time to time, and had an interaction and a chance for the researchers to find out what was going on. I continued to try to hold regional meetings in Dallas. Penn Jones had started a moment of silence there in 64, I guess it was, even right away, on the grassy knoll every November 22nd, and he broke one time and came to D.C. to the family gravesite up here at National Cemetery, but he asked me to continue that tradition there on the knoll, and I have had every year. So I also was having regional meetings of COPA as well as the national meetings here in D.C. And have continued that practice. And then on the anniversary years, the 40th, and now upcoming next year, the 45th, we're going to be doing Memphis and L.A. as well for the Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy. We do a commemorative event also in June, although nobody sees it because the students are gone, but June the 6th, I think it is, it marks the day that John F. Kennedy gave his talk saying we're all mortal, we all live on the same planet, breathe the same air, we all want our children to be happy and prosperous, and we're all mortal, and so we have to stop this arms race, we have to stop threatening the existence of the planet. And that, I think, was really the speech that took them over the edge, that led to precipitated his assassination, along with his plans to pull out of Vietnam. But we hold a commemorative event there and sometimes read parts of the speech. And we've done that annually, I guess, for 6 or 7 years now. But we try to keep the subject alive, and as I say, there is a whole new group of people after this JFK film came out. Suddenly, all these other people who hadn't been asking questions about it and for which it was past history came into it. Now, I don't know whether there'll be another surge like that. It's starting to feel so old that it's like talking about the Lincoln assassination or something. It's the last century, right? So, but I hope that it'll be kept alive long enough that, we'll get some sense of resolution. A lot of people like to play the game, even within the research community, that we'll never know. But I think that's silly. I think that it's an empirical question and we can know. I don't think it's something that you go over the evidence and you come up with 15 different conclusions. People do for their own aggrandizement or, to write their own book and have their own point of view. But, I think the hard evidence has pretty consistently led to certain places. And all the new information we get, serious researchers tends to build on those ideas, I think, and conclusions. Not only that there was a conspiracy and that Oswald was not guilty, but also what levels of the government, including the Joint Chiefs and the intelligence agencies, or anti-Castro Cubans, or Dallas oil men, but also what levels of the government, including the Joint Chiefs and the intelligence agencies, or anti-Castro Cubans, or Dallas oil men, or the different sort of backers of the assassination, or people that I think were used to some extent to cloud take credit at the time, take blame later, but their fingers, they're not the palm.
Can you talk about, you said one of the galvanizing events was the release of Oliver Stone's JFK.
Yeah, well, because a whole generation just didn't know by that point the details that we knew. They weren't reading about JFK any longer, weren't reading at all, pretty much, and so JFK was kind of a distant memory. And when Stone's film came out and was seen by thousands of people, Robert Groden got him to put a trailer in saying that the files had still not been released, and he has a little scene where he's with his kid, Kevin Costner playing Garrison, is with his son, saying, "I hope someday you'll be able to see the files." And then he has this statement that he puts up at the end that the files are still locked up. Well, that led to millions of letters into Congress asking for the files to be released, and it also kicked in a whole new generation of people that wanted to know about the Kennedy assassination. And so, you know, we were catching some of that early on in COPA. We never had huge budgets by any means, you know, but we captured a little bit of available money from the serious researchers and the more well-to-do ones in order to be able to start up. And the conferences barely break even every year, but we keep them going. We don't charge a lot for them because that's not what it's about. I think, as I say, I don't know if there'll be yet another surge because I think it's sort of fading into the past again. But if we could get a Martin Luther King Records Act, I'm sure it would renew interest in what happened to Dr. King. And there continue to be new books coming out. William Pepper's work, Orders to Kill and Acts of State, are both excellent recent works on that assassination. 2 nights ago I heard Manning Marable, a black academician and author, who's writing a new book. It won't be out till 2009, I think, from what he was saying, on Malcolm X, but he's done his own independent and completely original investigation of all the witnesses and the forensics in the Malcolm X assassination, and he reaches some of the conclusions that we've had presented at COPA, which is good. You know, that the only one of the 3 people arrested was actually part of the plot, that the plot involved more than 3 people, that it, you know, was planned out, even a walkthrough, he said, the night before at the Ottoman, to plan how it would be done. And a lot of interesting things about the police infiltration around Malcolm. So there's new and breaking material, new scientific evidence. Recent study on the statistics done with the bullets and bullet fragments and their chemical composition shows that there were 2 types of bullets involved. The Italian government just took the Mannlicher Carcano that Oswald was supposed to have used from that series and tried to fire it, and said that it takes a minimum of 18 seconds to get 3 shots off from that gun, which is way too long for the sequence in the Zapruder film to get even, you know, that's within 6.2 seconds 3 shots going off, which doesn't even give you time to aim. But they were coming up with a much more realistic sort of how long it would take to shoot 3 shots and aim them at something that's closer to 18 seconds. So there's no way that all those shots came out of Oswald's gun. If it was Oswald's gun, I don't even believe it was, but the one they say that he owned and ordered through the P.O. box, I think they planted it, just like they planted his pistol in the theater to try and kill him with his own, what would be seen as his own pistol, and blame it on him. So,
well, the research community, the early group, and you were 1.5,
right? And then I'd say 2.0 was the people who come in from the JFK, and then. Now, the other thing that's expanded it is internet, and there are internet forums now on JFK, quite a few of them. The first one I ever saw, the first time I ever turned on a computer, I went to news groups, I didn't even know what it was, and there was an alt-JFK conspiracy. And I went to it, and it had in those days, little folders for each comment. So I was scrolling down the folders, and one of the folders said, "John Judge is a liar." My introduction to the internet. And so I opened this thing up, and some guy's ranting against me, doesn't use his own name, calls himself Noel Rat, says a bunch of garbage about me, you know, that isn't true, says I shouldn't be allowed to be holding the moment of silence up on the Knoll, even though Penn Jones was the one that asked me to do it, in part because I have a beard. I don't know what matter that is, but my beard was longer and bigger in those days, but I didn't even know how to respond. I didn't know, do you stoop to try to answer something like this, or, and then other people were writing in saying, who is this guy? And other people were saying he's okay, or saying, I don't know what to think of him. And so, it's fraught with all of that you can get disinformation and suspicion and, things fly all around. But there are some serious research groups, I think, that have formed, that are forums online, and that, are led by good people, and they sort of filter out some of the garbage. But even some of the people suspected of being part of the assassination are on some of these forums.
Okay, so right now we have COPA, and can you tell me about the other groups? There's
well, I don't know how many
for 10 seconds.
The online organizations.
Right.
Well, now I'm not.
Right.
Are we back? I know where you were.
Okay, so
about the other groups.
Yeah, can you tell me about the other?
I don't know the
group?
names of all of the forums that are up for JFK, but I'm sure you could do a JFK.
The other research search. Groups,
but
the big one.
The only other large group that I'm aware of, Assassination Archive and Research Center, once in a while puts on a conference. It's not annual, but they've had some conferences in D.C., and I helped them get one of them on C-SPAN one year, and so it was nice. It was out right on, I think it was on Thanksgiving Day, so and it wasn't when the sport thing was on, so somebody actually probably saw it. I saw it in a bus station up in Massachusetts. It came in and they were doing the conference, but they still exist, and the only other group that I know is JFK Lancer, which started in the second year that COPA existed, and had a conference in Dallas that competed with our conference in D.C., and drew off a number of people. And then we eventually, I think it was the 30th anniversary, we did a conference in Dallas. I think that's our year, 30th anniversary.
Is that when you started doing the annual Dallas conferences?
Well, no, I was doing the regional conferences anyway, but we had one of our annual conferences there. But Lancer followed us around. Even when we went to L.A., they had a competing conference the same day. They're a for-profit group, and a lot of people that we didn't feel. We used to do peer review and look at abstracts of what people were going to present, and have a committee of people within the board and advisors and a chairman that was elected each year do a peer review and decide who could speak and who couldn't. And we didn't eliminate that many, but there were some that we just felt the stuff was speculative and not sort of rising up to the level of looking like research. And then we also weren't looking for global theories of who runs the whole world and the Illuminati is behind everything. We were looking for specifically oriented historical or forensic, an event oriented or characters within the milieu of suspects. What could that tell us? And a variety of the political assassinations, not just the big four. Like we had presentations about Walter Reuther, and other historical figures as well as the main ones. But Lancer would then highlight some of the people that we generally wouldn't present. Or they'd take people who wanted 3 hours at our conferences when the most we generally give is about a half an hour, so we can get more people in, and they could go over and have a big forum at Lancer. Lancer started rating our lists. If we'd announce early who was speaking, they'd call all of them, trying to get them to go to Lancer instead. And in some cases, they could offer to fly them in, which we couldn't, and they would make them promise not to come to our event if they appeared there. And and there was this just general contention, and what we felt was kind of not only creating a split within the research community, but also and animosities, but also presenting bad information and just not doing, what needed to be done. And so we've tried to work around that. We've had them come up with their sound systems on the grassy knoll and obliterate our moment of silence, which we've been holding there, but we go ahead and try to hold it. Or hold it after 12:30 when they're done singing Star Spangled Banner or whatever it is. And, I really don't know what the group's about. I mean, its politics are not clear to me. We can't hold a joint conference with them because we're a nonprofit and they're a for-profit, and that's forbidden under the nonprofit rules. So we can't take a joint gate or share any, income or resource with them. And their response to us saying that was that they pay their taxes proudly. Well, a group that in any serious way looks at the Kennedy assassination and knows that the same people have continued in power wouldn't, I think, be proud to pay them their taxes to kill the next president that gets in their way. I don't understand that comment. They talk about, their beloved president on the knoll, and they're not going to talk about who killed him. That's for the conference. But they've invited, in my view, some of the worst people, including some of the plotters, and put them up, to speak at their conferences. So, we've tried to hew to a different standard, and we're not commercializing it. We're not trying to sell 20 things. We have an independent book dealer. JFK Last Hurrah Books comes and puts out materials and resources at the conference. And we have someone that films and sells DVDs. I think they're $3 each to get the copy of the set for the 2 or 3 of them per COPA meeting. You can get all the hours of it. We're not in the money-making business. It's not what it's about. And we are trying to get the best evidence, the best truth forward that we can find. We were challenged in 2001 by Peter Dale Scott, one of the best JFK researchers, as a community to start looking into 9/11. I started an email network to bolster that, called Independent Network of Deep Politics Researchers, or InDeeper. That sort of expanded for me into 9/11 Citizens Watch, which worked with the families to get an investigation of 9/11. And then I've broken off since that time. We kind of dogged the commission as it existed to do a 9/11 research project, an independent project to deconstruct. But we have presentations now each year on 9/11, again, from the best evidence that we can find that's coming out, rather than just the speculations that some of the groups have about building demolitions or no planes or no Arabs on the plane or remote controlled or I don't know what all. I think now the latest one I heard is space beams knocked down the buildings from satellites. But anything's possible, but I try to deal in the realm of the nut and the bolt and what you can prove. And if I don't have to posit something more than rationality or scientific approach, I don't see any point in doing so.
Can you tell me what you know about Lancer?
I don't know too much about them. I mean, they were started by a woman. Her husband was introduced to me once in Dallas as an officer in military intelligence. They were living at Fort Ord. My understanding is that her family came from Metairie, when it was a little town outside, not so much a suburb, but a little town outside of New Orleans, and there were only 2 or 3 families at that point. Carlos Matrello's family was neighbors of theirs, I guess, and she came into the research community during the Ask period. She befriended Mary Farrell, and she came one time to a meeting in New Orleans that we had at the time of the review board having a meeting down there. I held a researchers meeting on the side at a restaurant, and she offered that she would write our newsletter, but we didn't even know who she was, so we don't farm the newsletter out to an individual. Other than that, I mean, first they tried to have a bookstore at our event, and even to the point that Tom Jones, a guy that she worked with, was going to only let our people come in after 7 o'clock. They were going to hog all the rooms for themselves, and then we could come in, even though it was our crowd that they were going to try to sell the books to. So they were self-defeating in that way. I mean, and then they, at one point they went to the hotel and almost got us kicked out because they posed themselves as COPA when they were not, and they were very obnoxious to the people there and threatening to sue them and yelling at them. And so when I called and said I'm calling about arranging for a hotel and space, they said, we don't talk to anybody from that organization. And I said, well, you haven't talked to me yet, and I'm COPA. And they said, no, your people were here. I said, I don't have any people there. And then I found out it was the Lancer people had hacked them all. So I just have kind of steered clear from them. People have complained to me about them, printing manuscripts and things. I don't know. I mean, some people go to both conferences and then they come and say that we should merge because they don't like traveling between the two of them. But my attitude is you should dance with the one that brung you. And if you think that there's a political reason for COPA to exist that's serious, then I think the second question that you have to ask yourself is there as serious a political reason for Lancer to exist? And if not, then I think you should support COPA. And I think we're doing it in a serious and non-commercial way that's a better way to do it. But I think there's also a segment of the society that wants wild theories, that wants titillation, that wants to hear, that the Zapruder film was a fake, that, and so I think they'll be drawn to that, and there's nothing I can say about them. Maybe they should be over there rather than at COPA. But I'm just trying to work with the people that I consider honest and independent and legitimate and well-informed and scientific and academic researchers into these cases to get at the truth, not to promote the latest theory or the wildest theory. And that's the effect, I think, is what I see over there from them doing that. But I don't really know who they are. I mean, I just know that they exist in competition to us, and I don't get the point. I think they claim we're elitist. I mean, if having that kind of standard as elitist, I suppose we are.
You talked a little bit about the splits within the community, and like you said, a lot of researchers go to Lancer, a lot go to
and
COPA,
try to go to both.
Nether Twain, they meet, but there are also individuals who have written books, somewhat respected researchers who don't go to either anymore. And thinking Fetzer comes to mind. Can you tell me?
Well, I've never had Fetzer speak at COPA. I think he spoke at Lancer, and I understood he had some falling outs with their leadership. So, but that's all I know. I mean, I've never had him speak at any of my conferences, and he has in numerous forms, both the JFK end and now that he started working on 9/11, said that I'm an agent of some sort. Well, he's welcome to his opinion.
You tell me about the different kinds of splits within the community. Because his research has been with the Zapruder film being
the Zapruder film being faked was one issue, and Fetzer came and disrupted one of the COPA conferences and tried to challenge Robert Groden to a debate over it one time. And there have been people that I consider just basically ego-driven. They want to be the kings of the research community. They may even have some good research, but their whole thing is to hoard information and put out their own book and claim that they've solved the case and no one else is right, and to vilify everyone else. And some of them, have done some valuable work, but I think that gets in their way. Livingston would be an example of that to me, where, he just, he wants to come in and basically say he's right and everybody else is garbage. And if that's your approach, to me, it's too defensive. There's got to be something wrong there, something underneath that you're either covering up or you're insecure about yourself. I mean, why not just put your material forward? Why do you have to attack everybody? Right. So those kinds of things would come up from time to time, or people that came up with a theory and, believed that you had to present it or else you were somehow censoring them or part of some cover-up. And, we had Daniel Piper wanted to come and present his book saying the Mossad killed Kennedy. I looked at his book. It was a rehash mostly of the stuff that was in the old Torbett document, which has some validity, but he was focused on anybody that had any Jewish connection. And I hardly think that Kennedy was killed because David Ben-Gurion, had a disagreement with him about a nuclear issue. I mean, I just don't see that the evidence goes in that direction without stretching it beyond, its tail. And you've got a guy who wants to present this who's also connected with Spotlight magazine and Holocaust deniers, and so his response to that, first he said he was going to have black Muslims come and picket at our event, and I said, well, good, maybe we'll get some press. And then he set me up by being part of organizing a forum on the West Coast that was going to be made up of people from Spotlight and the Holocaust deniers, but on JFK. I got a flyer at that Global Science Conference I told you about earlier. It has a flag on either side, and it says, "Did you know that the government was involved in killing John F. Kennedy?" And then the next line is, "And did you know that the government lied to you about the Holocaust?" So they've taken one of the cases that we've really done good work on and shown the public that there was a conspiracy with hard evidence, and then basically try to extrapolate that to say that because I can prove they lied to you once, then they're lying to you about everything, including the thing I want you to think they're lying about. And I said at that conference too to people, just because somebody tells you the government's lying doesn't mean they're not lying. Doesn't mean they're telling the truth. And so these are all sort of dodges and ways that information is presented, or, if the government says it, then obviously it's false, so what I'm saying is true. And I think those led to clashes over time between different people in the community who had different senses of the truth. But I'm not interested in having a big debate about whether the Zapruder film was faked. I mean, I think it was the best piece of evidence that we ever had. It's the piece of evidence that, when it was shown, convinced the public that there was a conspiracy. Saying it was faked, I mean, even if I thought there was any hard evidence, and I don't, all it does is Gerald Posner liked it. He said, well, now we have no criteria to determine what happened, so I must be right. Oswald acted alone. I think, but these canards, I think, come of small fish in wanting to be bigger fish in a little pond, and so they'll come up with something, or they'll have a theory, but the evidence doesn't fit their theory, so therefore the evidence must be wrong. They must have. He isn't shot where I think he's shot, so they must have doctored it. Well, I guess it's one way to proceed in determining what reality is, but it's not a very useful one in my view. And once you take it as a religion, then you can't be open to any opposing information. For instance, the people that don't believe Flight 77 went into the Pentagon, if the government now would release a videotape, like a security tape from the Sheraton, that showed the plane going in, they would immediately say it was fake, because they've convinced themselves that it didn't happen. So, it's and it's not to say that no evidence is ever faked, but why, just on the simplest level, why would you fake a film and then bury it for 30 years and not let anybody see it? What was the point of faking it? And and other films back up what happens in it. Taken from other angles, they match the timing and the events, and but I'm just saying I think certain people come up with theories in order to promote their own broader agenda, or just their own aggrandizement, as I solved it, I know something you don't. And unfortunately, even when the archives opened, I was hoping that researchers would find new documents and help us put them in the newsletter for COPA, to show that there was stuff in the files that hadn't been known before, and that it wasn't useless to release the information, that it did help prove conspiracy. And I think it has rewritten a lot of history. But I found that most researchers would find something and they wouldn't tell anybody, and they'd just hoard it, and because they were going to put it in their book. So even though it's a public document, they were treating it like a private treasure that they had found, instead of sharing it with people. So that sense of collegiality and sharing has diminished over the years in parts of the community, and there have been rifts, and but I think the really serious people pretty much still talk to each other and work together and try to collaborate. But And there are people that, as you say, they don't go to either conference, and they're not so much interested in the conference, and our attendance has dropped off over the years, and people had the experience. Some are committed and want to get new stuff every year, and some people like seeing all the friends that they've made over the years, or other researchers are hearing about the latest book. But a lot of people can, with technology, you can stay home and pay $6 and sit in your living room and watch it. So instead of paying $600 to go make a trip, I don't know. I mean, I think anniversary years will bring it back, and maybe we'll get as far as the 50th and still have a crowd. Beyond that, I don't know what we'll have. And so the amount of time left to solve it or do something with it or get a grand jury or another hearing, another investigation, it diminishes over time. But I do think we, in large part, do know and can know, and even have known much from the beginning, that this was a coup d'etat, and it was elements within the government and within segments of the moneyed sectors and corporate sectors of the society that killed the president and ended that sense of democracy. One of them that figures through a lot of it is a guy named Lawrence Schiller, and his name's doesn't usually come to most people's tongues, but if you go back, the very first attack on the Warren Commission critics was a book called Scavengers and Critics of the Warren Commission, written by, I think it's Tim Considine. He was like one of the TV personality. But the book's subtitle is based on an investigation by Lawrence Schiller. Lawrence Schiller is the co-author with Norman Mailer of Oswald's Ghost, which I understand they're making a movie out of now. Another piece of disinformation, supposedly based on records available in the Soviet Union, but those records, if they were brought back, were never released to any other researchers by Mailer or Schiller. Schiller is often the only journalist allowed in certain cases, which means that he has to have some collaboration or clearance with the intelligence agencies or the tops of the police structure. Like, he was the only one allowed in to interview any of the Manson family members. He bragged at one point that he was in both Dealey Plaza when Kennedy was shot and in the pantry in Los Angeles when Robert Kennedy was shot. There have been other books that relied on his supposed investigation, including one about the death, I believe, of Lenny Bruce, which was contested by the widow. He just reappears all the time, this sort of hack that is providing information to disinform, and getting well paid in the meantime to do it. He and Norman Mailer came and spoke at one of the ASK conferences, and Marina Oswald got up and walked out. There have been different ones over the years. William Bradford Huey, He Slew the Dreamer, changed the title from They Slew the Dreamer and cut an illegal deal to pay for James Earl Ray's attorney fees from the sales of an exclusive book, so that he was the only one that he could talk to. And even that conspiracy even went down to what he was going to plead in the court and how much he was going to tell or not tell the court to keep it exclusive to the book. And there's one point at which James, in the little mini trial, if you can call it a trial, let's just like read out a couple of statements and convict him. He pipes up when they say there's no conspiracy, and he says, "I don't agree with that conclusion." And the judge turns to the lawyer and says, "Wasn't he instructed basically not to say this?" And then the attorney turns to Ray and tells him to sit down and shut up. And, but that was all part of the backhand deal. And then Posner came in right at the time. The release of his books coincided with the release of the files. So the theme was, and his book is called Case Closed. So the theme was that day, files are open, the case is closed. When in fact, exactly the opposite was true. The case was still open, and many of the files were still closed. But at least we were starting to get them out. And he came on in the classic way that they do, pretending to be a critic, and then writing in the book, oh, I believed like everyone else that there was a conspiracy, but now as I looked at the evidence, I don't think it's the case. It's a trick that Bugliosi played and describes himself in one of his articles on law students, which is kind of a reverse spin on what we did all those years, because like Alan Dulles told Hal Boggs when he said that they should release some of the evidence, we'll go ahead and release it, nobody will read it anyway. They assumed that we wouldn't read it, and a lot of the people who believe that Oswald acted alone haven't read anything and haven't looked at the volumes and haven't looked at the evidence, and so that was always, something that we pointed out in terms of the work that we had done that was more thorough. So he goes into a law class and he says, well, how many of you here believe that Oswald was part of a conspiracy, or that, there was a conspiracy to kill JFK? And most of the hands go up, these young law students. And he says, and how many of you have read the 26 volumes? Nobody. Well, if you read the 26 volumes like I have, you'd know that Oswald acted alone. So, and I don't know what Bugliosi is doing with this, but I'm suspect of him all the way going back to, the Manson case, and his prosecution of Manson and his separate prosecution of Tex Watson on completely different theories. One that Manson controlled everyone, and the other on that Watson acted alone. Which is really what happened. I mean, Charlie wasn't at the murder sites. Watson was there with the girls and leading them, and he couldn't even get him extradited from Texas. Bugliosi couldn't get Watson out of Texas because his family was from the Dallas Police Department, TURF, and going back to the Kennedy assassination, no one even knew why Watson was there with these people, because he'd been an All-American sort of football hero, and All-American boy, and what's he doing with this hippie Manson? Helter Skelter, I thought, was, a particularly disinformative book about who Manson really was and what was behind that operation and how it was used to discredit the entire counterculture and the hippies. And
interesting.
We gotta stop. Change tape. You want to?
Well, I think it's in the press's interest, since they refused to do an honest investigation and therefore complicit over the years in the cover-up and to that extent the crime. Whenever someone will come out and back them up and say, no, there was no conspiracy, Oswald acted alone, Ray acted alone, then it lets them off the hook. And so they promote those books, and they give them all. I can remember Katie Couric, one of the talk show coordinators on primetime TV, sitting with Gerald Posner with a cup of coffee in her hand. She said, Gerald, you just did tons and tons and tons of research. like a 16-year-old girl or something. I don't know what. Just like tons and tons of research. Well, what do you think we didn't do tons of research? I mean, of course we did. But we didn't put together a lawyer's brief to twist everything in our, in that direction, which is basically what Posner's book and Bugliosi himself do. I mean, they take everything and try to twist it as if, and they accept uncritically the facts that matter, and then they pose these things. If Oswald wasn't a nice guy to somebody, then that means, of course, he shot the president. They try to debunk some of the statements of the critics, but they don't do a very good job. But yeah, the press loves them, and the press promotes them and gives them, the thumbs up, even before they have time to read his 1,300 page plus 1,100 pages more in a CD at the back of the book, obviating the need for a volume 2. I mean, who's going to read that? At this late point, what proportion of the public is reading a 1,300 page book about the Oswald and the Kennedy assassination? I don't think so. Maybe they're buying it and putting it on their bookshelves so it look like they did, but it's hard enough for us to get through it. I mean, care about the matter, and it hasn't exactly been a bestseller, I'm sure. You have a complicity though between the press, which knows what to say, even when new evidence breaks, they have to discredit it. They've created this not only a merging of all the conspiracies lumped into one, so that if you believe JFK was killed by a conspiracy, you must also believe in UFOs, you must also believe in this and that and that. I mean, they've lumped it all together into this conspiracy theorists. Those used to be two separate words. Now it seems you can't say conspiracy without saying theorist. But, my first response to that was, well, you can call me a conspiracy theorist if you call everyone else a coincidence theorist. But I'm just a historian. I mean, I may not come to your conclusion, but it doesn't mean that I'm not using a methodology that's similar to yours, or that I'm out of touch with the facts, or I'm just making up theories. It also doesn't mean that I believe that the whole world is controlled by 6 people, to say that there's conspiracies. I mean, lawyers pose and prosecutors pose conspiracies all the time. And, probably the bulk of, of criminal work is looking at conspiratorial. Alleged or not, true or not. I mean, certainly in terms of RICO Act and organized crime, these are conspiracies. So, 2 people plan to or act on something illegal, that's a conspiracy. When it involves the death of the president, you also have a political aspect to it. But it's not just that I went out there and tried to find something, whole cloth. I was trying to figure out why and how the president died. I didn't have a theory in mind. I wasn't set. And even the conclusion I have now, based on all the work that I've done, I would be willing to have it challenged if I could find somebody that took the same facts and went in a different direction, but I don't find credible things going in that direction. What I find is things, reinforcing it. So, but the other theme is that we conspiracy theorists have a psychological makeup that we just can't stand it when something happens, when a lone individual can kill the president. It creates this terrible tension for us, and we feel we live in a totally chaotic and unsafe world, and the only thing that gives us any sense of order again and security is to pose a conspiracy. And then if it was a conspiracy and not just a lone nut, well, then we feel better. Well, I'm sorry, I don't fluff my pillow at night and sleep easily with the thought that this was no lone nut. This was a conspiracy of vast proportion that took over the government and killed my president. Boy, I can sleep well now. I don't know where they come up with this pop psychology nonsense, but, and there may be some people for whom that's some sort of kind of a psychological defense mechanism, but not the researchers I know. I mean, and Penn Jones used to say, and I loved his work and also his just brilliant sense of humor, he used to say, well, we've been in the death grip of the military-industrial complex since November 22nd, 1963. Now let's all pray I'm wrong. And we all do pray we're wrong. We'd rather be wrong than right. We'd rather not have to live in the world that evidence takes us to, because it's not a happy conclusion. On the other hand, if I had to live in a world where I felt that I couldn't know the truth, that I couldn't know anything, that would be disturbing to me. I feel that it is possible to get at things and use a rational method and use science. But the society, especially with the fall down in the quality of education since I was born, with the rise of media, videos, television, I think consciousness itself has changed. I think the speed at which we take information in has changed. I think that our relation to taking in that information has changed, because when it comes to us through those electronic modes, we don't have time to stop and reflect. If I'm reading a book, I can stop, think about it for a minute. I can go get another book, compare it, see if a fact that they're referring to, see what it says. I can back up. I can, read several books over a period of time and kind of take notes. And in that passive mode we're put in by the television, everything's just slamming in. We don't have time to evaluate it. And similarly with the internet. I mean, we don't have a screen that says, okay, this is good information, this is bad information. It's just overload of information. And so within that milieu, and within accepting things that way, I think it's very easy to put out something like loose change I don't know if you know this video. It's all over the place, purporting to be and explain or prove something about a conspiracy with controlled demolitions in the buildings and the planes not hitting the Pentagon, and et cetera, et cetera. People watch that and they say, boy, that's compelling, because they think they've seen something. But it's classic, it's what magicians use, it's what suggestion is. You're showing them something, but then you're telling them what they're seeing. And so, and then they believe it all the more because they've seen it with their own eyes. But it's not that they didn't see the video image with their own eyes. It's the interpretation that you've laid on top of it that they've then accepted as part of that truth. I had one of the JFK critics who bought into this whole thing about the plane not going in the Pentagon. I was telling him there were at least 300 witnesses in the area, in buildings and on the ground, that actually saw the plane and described the size of the plane and its silver color, and some its logo, and some that knew it was a 757, and large commercial plane. And he said, well, you know that eyewitnesses are notoriously unreliable. I said, that's not what you say about the people in Dealey Plaza. When they run up the knoll, you say that means that the shot came from up there. You don't call them notoriously unreliable. Well, yes, one individual eyewitness can get it wrong. A single eyewitness. That's why you look for what's called a preponderance of evidence. You look at, if there were 300 people and 299 agreed, and there's one or two others that think they saw something else, well, then you're going to go with the 299, unless that one or two are in some special vantage point where no one else could see what they saw. Or weren't that close or whatever. Mm-hmm. Okay? But if they're just in the same crowd in the same place, yeah, sometimes people make mistakes, sometimes people fill in their memories. It's not absolutely reliable, but it's not worthless. And a 757 up close is a pretty, pretty solid experience that most people, they'll remember it, and it won't be comparable to too much else in their life. So I think, it's suspending criteria, but it's also creating a post-literate and post-historical and post-scientific and post-logical society. Because you no longer have to, it's sort of like, to give you one example, when you use a cell phone, you no longer memorize phone numbers. Okay? When you use a calculator, you no longer have to know how to do the math, you can just have the machine do it. And so in the same way, I think, video and media and films have come to replace our responsibility. We let commentators tell us what reality is. We live our lives through the lives of other people, celebrities and others. And we have a very little independent critical thought. It's not something that's taught in school. Very little methodology to try and figure out what history is. And so then it's all the more easy to both manipulate it and distort it and lie about it. Priscilla Johnson, who was a journalist for North American Newspaper Alliance, who was in Moscow when Oswald defected, so-called, was told by Richard Snyder, who took Oswald's passport and later gave it back to him and kept it and didn't remove his citizenship, even though he said he was going to sell secrets to the Russians and wanted to end his citizenship. Snyder was naval intelligence, as was Oswald. Told Priscilla McMillan to go over and interview him at the Metropole. And she came up with the first article in 1958, I believe it was, that said that Oswald had defected to the Soviet Union. Now, in fact, there were 9 defectors that went in the same month from the Naval Intelligence Program, and 9 that came back the same month, Oswald among them. When Marina testifies, and she's asked to give a background story on Oswald coming to the Soviet Union, she gives the background story on a guy named Robert Webster, who was one of the 9, but not Oswald's story. And she talks about a guy going to a scientific fair, like expedition, and then defecting from there and living at this particular place in Moscow, which was where Webster lived, not where Oswald lived. Priscilla then also comes home, and when Svetlana Stalin's daughter, defects, she goes to stay with Priscilla Johnson's parents in upstate New York. Well, you can imagine the historical significance of Stalin's daughter. Would you just send her up to see, Uncle Harry and Aunt Nell, some nobody? And no, that's a debriefing team. And she comes home and stays with Svetlana and helps her write her memoirs, translate her memoirs. So that's all a debriefing operation. She later becomes Priscilla Johnson Macmillan. She marries a guy named George Macmillan, who himself had written a book saying that James Earl Ray was the lone assassin on Dr. King. So they not only exist, they intermarry. And they co-author books together. And they work in a tiny milieu, but they are promoted by major publishing houses. One of the people behind Posner's books, a guy named Loomis at Random House, has connections to the CIA. Posner has access to talk to people in the Soviet Union that he couldn't have gotten without agency collaboration or cooperation to set it up. They're allowed to see archives that we're not allowed to see. When the flap came up about the records from Jim Garrison that the New Orleans district attorney didn't want to give over to the review board, Connick Sr., the person that was allowed in to see them while the review board and we could not, and who wrote an article saying that there was nothing in them of any consequence, was Haynes Johnson, I think. And who was it, Haynes Johnson? It's the guy that sold the Oswald diary earlier, but he, which is also, we believe, a forgery. But it's these same journalists or pseudo-journalists, assets, I think, is basically what they are for the intelligence agencies. And Carl Bernstein said there were 400 of them in the 70s. Probably many more now, and some assets that are just nothing but, like North American Newspaper Alliance, nothing but a front for intelligence, planting of stories and other things. And so, they reappear, and they're called on to do the hit pieces, and they're called on to appear to, on talk shows to counter the critics. But generally, the critics are just dismissed, or like you say, the things are, maybe they're reported for one day. There's been a study that showed this, blip. I can remember being sick and watching news coming in the night of the House Select Committee on Assassinations finishing its report. And the news woman said, the government House Select Committee has released a report saying that there was a probable conspiracy in the death of John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King. Now for the weather. Now for the weather? I mean, that's the headline of the century. Now for the weather? Yeah, it's not very good out though. The weather report is dangerous. Batten the hatches. So it's contextual framework even. I mean, there's how do you do it? Four arguments for the elimination of television, Jerry Mander's book, that you can't get a progressive idea across on that medium. But they don't have the framework. Journalism students now don't read the newspapers. And probably half of them want to be journalism students just so they can meet the celebrities and interview them. I saw one of the comedians here, Mark Russell, was at a commemoration for Sarah McClendon, who used to come to our COPA meetings, and a sort of long-time maven of the press, and broke the gender barrier at the press club and got the first women into the lunchroom, and went to all the press conferences for the presidents and Kennedy and the rest of them. It was well known right up to Bush and before she died. And what he said at the commemoration was, he said, I wonder if the thin fascist news babes over at Fox News ever want to grow up and become Sarah McClendon. So we don't have news. We have propaganda. We have spin. We have editorials posing as regular articles. We have
pieces that are major stories that are censored and other things that are omitted. I found that even in reading the newspaper, the last paragraph often contains what you need to know, not the first. That it's journalism upside down, because they know most people don't read to the end. But the real zingers will often be in the very last paragraph. But it's also a framework, a paradigm, an ability to cast something in a light that you can respond to it or know what it is, a sense that you own your own history, or that you have any control over anything, or you're just merely a spectator, which again is this media milieu. Am I just a spectator to the Kennedy assassination? Or am I a participant in the society that killed him? And what is my role then in a democracy? So it's getting at different things, but I think we have to take the responsibility if we don't want to live under fascism. If we want to have a democracy, we have to take the responsibility to all be participatory and be involved and be in charge and own this society for all of its faults or whatever, but own it in the sense that we want to change it and address it and confront it. It's easier to go away. I mean, and I realize, a lot of people have to spend most of their lives in wage slavery just trying to have enough salary to keep their kids alive, keep some food on the table, keep their marriage together. And the little bit of free time they've got, the last thing they want to be doing is reading a 1,300-page book by Ms. Bugliosi, much less 26 volumes of the War Commission report. So we don't have to do the same work, but those that think that this is an area of interest have to take the time to do some reading and sorting out, and then figure out a way to talk about it and to talk about it with others and try to organize things and pull things together. And so, I spent the last 2 years up on the Hill working for Cynthia McKinney, and a great progressive congresswoman, and she had me draft a Martin Luther King records bill, and it was literally ready to pass, I think. I mean, it had 67 co-sponsors on the House side, which is a huge number. It had been adopted as a sister bill on the Senate side, first by John Kerry and then by Hillary Clinton. So it had its momentum there and would have come to the floor, and it was the same bill, or any changes. It was modeled on the JFK Records Act. It had endorsements from about 20 leading civil rights leaders, former members of the House Select Committee on Assassinations that had studied the King case, organizations, including the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, all calling for the release of these records. I even got a quote out of Ebony magazine that the file should be opened from Congressperson Stokes, who had been the one that locked them up. So, we had great public support. The only thing that killed it was that some of the family members, after Coretta King's death, balked at the release, fearing that some dirt would come out on their father. And we didn't have the time at that point, that late in the congressional session, to get a change of mind to get the thing going. And so the offices that were sort of balking on doing something were sitting waiting to know what the family thought. But it doesn't discourage me from going back in this Congress and trying to get it. And I think that by pulling our energies together and working together, we can make changes. I mean, we've gotten releases of documents that have rewritten the whole history. Mexico City, the Oswald doubling, Bay of Pigs, Cuban Missile Crisis, all been rewritten by the records that we got released. And the Kennedy assassination itself. Garrison's speculations have been borne out by those records. And there's more still in them. No one's finished going through them, and they're not all released yet. There's still more to be reviewed and released. And so I think that to those that have the commitment, it's worth the time, and that it's not a losing proposition. But will we get cooperation from the mainstream media? No. Not on our whole thesis, but we may get it if we are strategic about how we release the data and find the things. I mean, often an individual story can get released. Well, I think that, you have individuals writing books, and there's hundreds of books on the Kennedy assassination at this point. Not all of them great, but, and depending on what you want to know, because often people say, what's the best book? And it's like, well, what do you want to know? You want to deconstruct the Warren Commission, maybe Sylvia Moore. You want to know who did it? Well, maybe, deep politics in the JFK assassination and Peter Dale Scott's work, there's compilations, later, Crossfire, and Noel Twyman's book, Bloody Treason, that pulled together some of the best evidence pointing somewhere. There's who is Oswald? I mean, you got Phil Melanson's work on Oswald, so and John Newman's work from the New Files on Oswald and the CIA. It depends on what you want to know. The people that want the whole thing laid out to them in 5 or 6 chapters, well, I don't know. I suppose you can get Carl Oglesby's little pamphlet-sized book, who killed JFK, if you just want the, the notes version. But and even he is just presenting a number of possible suspects. But I think what we'd have to have 2 criteria. I think we have to have a criteria of grounding the research in historical documentation, record, fact, scientific analysis, and forensic analysis. So that's first. I mean, to have logic and science involved, and rationality and documentation and historical method in what we do. The other is then, in a sense, the reverse of that, boiling that down into some kind of language or shortcut that can help people understand. But just yesterday I was talking to somebody, and I was making a comparison between the false identities that were used for the hijackers in 9/11, because 8 people came forward from Saudi and Egypt afterwards and said, that's me, that's my picture, my ID, I wasn't on the plane, I'm not part of the plot. So you've got false ID being used, which is part of covert operations and part of what's called a legend, creating a legend. You can't go backwards with that in time and then say, well, these same 19 guys were at a meeting in a cell in Hamburg, because you don't know who was at that meeting. The original person whose real name it is, the person who got on the plane using their name, or a third person who was at that point using their name. Okay. So once the identity has been stolen, being used, you don't know who's involved in going where or what they're trying to do. But the example I gave was that 2 weeks prior to the Kennedy assassination, someone that we now know was also with CIA complicity was doubling Lee Harvey Oswald in Mexico City, going to the Soviet embassy. It was not Oswald. We know the agents in Dallas listened to the tape and said it wasn't his voice, who were familiar with him. The picture of the guy emerging from the meeting doesn't look at all like Oswald, the surveillance picture. And the House Select Committee found that stuff. But he's trying to get into to see Castro and to visit Cuba 2 weeks before the assassination, Well, a lot of people don't know that, but I mean, that's a pretty telling fact that the CIA was involved in having someone impersonate Oswald in the Soviet embassy in Cuba and at the Cuban, in Mexico City and the Cuban embassy, and then trying through that to say that he wanted to move to Cuba, he wanted to visit Cuba and go down there, and they wanted to make arrangements. And also linking him through that, ostensibly with a guy at the Soviet embassy that was part of the their sort of military intelligence assassination squads. 2 weeks before the assassination, someone's doing this. Why? But and then if you realize that from Operation Northwoods, the document that was released under the JFK Act, which was a plan by the Joint Chiefs and signed off on by all of them to create a traumatic incident that would terrorize the public and then could be blamed on Castro and could be then used as an excuse to invade Cuba and kill Castro. And this involved riots in Miami that would kill people that could be blamed on him, blowing up a ship in Guantanamo Bay, creating a fake airline accident with fake obituaries sent to the local papers, using a drone that they would then shoot down, and even blowing up John Glenn on the way to the moon in a space capsule in a way that would be able to be blamed on Castro. Traumatic, nationally traumatic incidents that could then lead to justification for an invasion. Well, Kennedy refused. Kennedy balked. Kennedy wouldn't sign off on this nonsense. And then comes November 22nd. And I've talked to Navy SEALs who were offshore that day, offshore Cuba, ready to go in and kill Castro. I've talked to people and seen letters by people in public places and books who were being loaded onto transport planes at bases that day, and bases on alert, and being getting ready in full gear to go and invade Cuba on November 22nd, 1963. So I think Northwoods was carried out, and it was the Kennedy assassination. That was going to be the traumatic incident. And the problem was that Oswald, instead of being a dead red that they could say was a Castro lover and a commie, and Castro did it, instead protected himself from being shot in the Texas theater and stopped that, and then they had a talking head that they didn't know what to do with, didn't take any notes, etc. But I'm just saying just that simple fact that someone was pretending to be Lee Harvey Oswald 2 weeks before the assassination in Mexico City in a way that could have led to them people blaming the assassination on Castro. That's what I'm talking about, boiling down the documentary trail to a simple fact like that doesn't fit the paradigm of most people. And they would go, well, why were they doing that? Or what's that about? Or I didn't know that. The response to this person I mentioned it to is he said, well, that seems a little far-fetched. I said, well, it's not far-fetched in the documentary record. It happened. I see even J. Edgar Hoover wrote in one of the memos that we have that someone was doubling Oswald. When he checked on it. He writes in the memo, someone's doubling this guy. So, I mean, they know it internally. We now know it externally from the documents and the record. We also Copa went down and met with Escalante, Fabian Escalante, and Rodriguez, two of the top Cuban intelligence guys at the time in '63, who knew it from the Cuban end, their embassy's end of the story in Mexico City, and compared notes with our researchers. And I had a very interesting meeting down in the Bahamas with these guys, and what sort of their theories were and who they were looking at the time. So it's not that the thing didn't happen, but if it doesn't fit your framework, then either you're going to deny it, or possibly the other option is like in Zen, when the master, who you have to recognize as a master, poses the koan, the question that can't be answered within your paradigm of assumptions in your matrix, then you're going to have to jump out of that matrix. And you might jump into a new one, or you might just reach Satori or realization. So, I mean, the predominant paradigm in this country is that things happen due to incompetence, not malice, not evil, and that the government is basically benign. It may bungle, it may bumble along, it may hurt someone inadvertently, but it would never do something as outrageous as kill its own president. But there's other paradigms out there. On the other hand, I don't believe that the government lies about everything, absolutely everything. I don't believe that we live in a computer construct like the Matrix. I don't think every single thing is a plot against someone. I don't think that the government spends endless amounts of time following and harassing single individuals and speaking into their heads through devices and things like that. Not that they don't have the capability, but I just don't think they sit by a microphone 24/7 and bother somebody. But somebody called me from the science desk of the Post the other day asking if they had heard from people in the demonstration on the 15th against the war that they had seen these things that looked like dragonflies, but they thought they were mechanical, and they thought that they were something that was being used to spy on them. And I said, well, I have read about them trying to develop little fly-size listening devices that they could stick into a room and maybe even have video capability, but put on the wall, like a fly on the wall, literally. But that's in a closed room. In an open demonstration, what's the point? I said, did they make any noise? And they said, yes. They said it made whirring sounds. I said, well, then they're pretty useless for audio. I said, and the way they're going to be jerking around like a dragonfly, I don't think they're going to get very much good video either. It's kind of like a guy in the middle of a demonstration running along with the camera. You see things, in spurts, but you're not getting a very good picture. So if it's not for those two things, unless it's a miniature predator that's going to inject you with some lethal thing, I don't know what is the purpose of this device. Flying around in the middle of a demonstration, what are they going to hear that they can't hear with a distant mic, or, isn't being already projected sound from the stage or chanted by 100 voices? I mean, people don't usually go to demonstrations to have private conversations that nobody will ever otherwise hear if they're not followed by a secret dragonfly. So, I mean, I can't rule it out, but why rule it in? I mean, I don't see what purpose it would serve. And I don't live my life looking over my shoulder, even though I realize that they can kill me from a satellite if they want to. We have to decide how we're going to live, not how we're going to die. And so I don't fit, the sort of classic idea that all the conspiracy theorists are personal paranoids. We all live like Mel Gibson, who I was compared to by John McLaughlin, said that Gibson had a John Judge personality in the movie Conspiracy Theory. Well, here's a guy that doesn't even go in his front door. He climbs over the roof of the next building. He comes in his window. He puts a bottle on his doorknob in case anybody jiggle it from the other side, it'll break and alert him somebody's trying to get in. He rigs the room to blow up if the wrong person ever comes in and doesn't turn the little switch off. He locks his milk cartons with a with a combination lock so nobody will drink his milk. I mean, you've been here. I don't spend my time looking over my shoulder, even though I know there are evil forces, and even though if they wanted to, they could kill me. I don't know what good it would do them. Some people used to ask me at the end of my lectures, well, if this is all true, why haven't they killed you? And I said, well, first of all, it's a rude question, and you're giving them ideas. But I said, secondly, my final answer is probably just that if they killed me, it wouldn't help them. I said, they leave me alive to discredit me. Because if they killed me, then you'd know I was right. Why should I think I'm worth killing? It's far easier to ignore me or discredit me or laugh at me, than to take me serious. But, for those few of us who know that we're in the twilight of democracy and, want to be together, and I wrote to Ben Jones about this, I mean, we try to find the truth and we try to stand together and based on the truth, and we try to move society or what we can, but Malcolm X said by any means necessary, and I always say by any means possible, and use some strategy, but getting an idea across to the public on something this complex and this momentous shouldn't involve grabbing them by the collar and saying, you have to listen to me. It should be something that uses good information. And I have now this grant to do a museum of hidden history, and I want to do really accessible and engaging exhibits of the best evidence for young people to come and see, tourists to come and see. 6 million people visit here every year, and to have them come and participate in a museum kind of experience with exhibits with real information about the assassinations, about covert operations, about why they hate us, and to get out the history that's not there. But I want it to be attached to a research center that students can, take part in and actually begin to research these things. I want to have it have the capability to show a new documentary film or have an author speak when new books on hidden history come out and break things open. I'd like to have a capability there to do press conferences when new documents come out or a new scientific study is released, that we can easily get the Washington Press there. But to have a strategy, have a legal strategy, legislative or grand jury, whatever, but to have a rational strategy that can influence people. I don't live in a world where I think people have to all think exactly the same as me or all come to my same conclusions in order to be able to get toward something that asks real questions. And if nothing else, hampers the ability of people to do what was done in 1963. Even if I don't take them all to jail, a lot of them are dead now anyway. It's not a matter of revenge for me. It's a matter of prevention and increasing the function of democracy. Well, I found out about Penn Jones just at Yellow Springs, Ohio Antioch College Library when I was first doing the work. I went out and looked at their library, and they had a volume of Forgive My Grief, the first volume, which was a collection of articles from his Midlothian newspaper. And I really loved his style, and I also thought that he was on to things, and he was starting to track the deaths of the witnesses. And so it was a kind of groundbreaking work that he was doing early on, and I found him there in the late 60s. got in touch with him. He was a very interesting guy. He was, brought up on like red dirt farm, Texas, farming family, and he went off to World War II. He became a brigadier general, promoted out of the ranks because near the end of the war they were losing so many men and officers that they had to do field promotions. And I often laughed about the fact that here's this brigadier general and this conscientious objector who agree on almost everything. So, and he was combat hardened, and he had also been part of units that had freed and liberated the concentration camps. So he had seen the Holocaust up close. He had also seen, I.G. Farben and the post-war German cartels, and the U.S. collaboration with the fascists. He came home to Midlothian, and he wanted to write a newsletter. And he was feisty, and he was liberal, and he was friends with John Howard Griffin, who wrote Black Like Me, a white man who had his skin toned in order to fit in and actually live in the black community and experience it from the other side. Wrote about it, but he was also a great photographer. If you ever get his book of photographs, Penn is in there. And he knew other thinkers. He knew Thomas Merton and went to visit him and the Trappist monks over the years, and Jacques Ellul. And, he was a very progressive and open-minded guy, and he had a great sense of humor. And when I met him, he was still married to his first wife.
You said he was a writer?
Hmm?
You said he was a writer? He wrote for...
Penn Jones. Yeah, well, he wrote for just his own newspaper. He formed his own newspaper in Midlothian. He bought the paper specifically to have, capability. So, and it's an amusing irony. I mean, if you have an old issue of the Midlothian Mirror, it's mostly about bake sales and hog roasts and the local high school. And then there's an editorial that says, Mysterious Death Number 53. And a critique of the Warren Commission going on the pages of this little small town. It's like about 30 miles out of Dallas, to the south. It was where eventually they first started to put the super collider there, and then it was defunded. But if it had been there, he would have been a millionaire, because he had a little farm that they would have had to buy, in order to get to it. So he died impoverished, but if those plans had gone through, he could have made a mint. I think he loved Kennedy. He was there in town. Well, there were attempts to burn his paper down, the Klan, and he fought them right on the scene. And he was feisty, and he would stand up, and he had that kind of wry sense of humor, when he'd speak. He talked about meeting some guy in a bookstore, and he's saying that Jack Ruby used to come in there all the time, and he said the hair stood up on the back of his neck, and he said Jack Ruby had no more business in a bookstore than a bull in a china shop. And but he was going to cover Kennedy's talk, and he was out at the Trade Mart at the luncheon room waiting when word came that he'd been shot, and he jumped in a car with a bunch of other reporters and scooted back to the scene. And so he was there that day at Dealey Plaza, picking up the beginnings of the news. He eventually got photographs taken by a Dallas Morning News reporter of them picking up a bullet on the other side of Elm Street, south side of Elm. That's never been part of the official investigation, but you have photos of a guy bending over, picking it up, picture of the bullet on the ground and looking at it, and this guy pockets it and then walks off, and that bullet disappears from the official story, never mentioned. So he just kind of had an intuitive suspicion about how they were lying to him. He would have been a great sort of city desk reporter had he worked in a city, but he was doing this all on his own and from outside. But he conducted an investigation that should have been conducted by the Dallas Morning News, and then he would lecture, and I got him to come out and talk at my school, University of Dayton. He eventually divorced and remarried a woman named Elaine, and that was when they were living out on the farm in Waxahachie. And this was after, the paper had gone on. But he kept selling the books. He went through 4 volumes of Forgive My Grief, collecting his articles. And he knew famous people. The cover of one of the books is done by Elaine de Kooning, who's a fairly well-known New York artist. He was a researcher's researcher. He wasn't somebody who was making a mint. He self-printed these little books. And most of it was ignored, but he, to those in the research community who knew him, he was very generous. He would always share information in his time, and he was a lovable cuss. But I sort of bonded with him, and we always liked each other, and I would go out in the knoll with him and spend time at his house and send him material, and contributed to his Continuing Inquiry newsletter that he did later.
What about Lifton?
I haven't had too much dealing with Lifton. He did this book, Best Evidence, which is based on a lot of good reviews of the medical stuff. I'm not sure that he's right that they worked with another body or did surgical alteration. I don't know that they had to. I think they were pretty much in charge of what happened at Bethesda. And they had enough control there that they blocked a real autopsy from happening. So I don't know that they had to fake a wound. But there's something wrong
in the medical evidence.
Yeah, and in the sequence of things. And I talked to Paul O'Connor, who was just a young Navy intern who was working on Kennedy's head, and he told me for the first time we knew that it was a teaching morgue, and there were bleachers, and there were about 60 people watching the autopsy, which I never knew. I thought it was done all in the hush. There were a lot of people there, including a general that was sitting there smoking a cigar, and O'Connor said at one point, Admiral Hume said, "Go tell that SOB with the stogie to get the hell out of here." And he told me he ran toward the bleachers, and when he got close enough to see the guy, turned on his heel and came back. And then the next time around, Hume said, "Did you tell him what I said?" And he said, "Sir, that's General Curtis LeMay." And he said, "So I didn't say anything to him, sir." Outranked him a little. So, but I've always thought that LeMay had a major role. And here he was, obviously, sort of sitting up there grinning and smoking a cigar enough to irritate Hume. Also, O'Connor told me that his friend had a job of working on the x-rays and then running the x-rays after they were taken up to some place in the tower at the Bethesda facility where they had a lab that would develop the x-rays into sheets that could be looked at by the doctors on the backlighting. And he took the first set up after they'd been working on the body for about a half an hour and ran it back down. And on the way in, bringing the pictures, he stopped where O'Connor was at Kennedy's head, and he said, "Well, you'll never guess who I just saw coming in here." And he said, "Who's that?" He said, "Jackie Kennedy came in with her hand on the casket." Well, was that all a decoy? Was it an empty casket? If Kennedy was in the casket, then who the hell are they working on? But, it raises a question as to what was going on there.
Wow.
But I think, Kennedy his features were recognizable enough still that I think it would have been hard to substitute any other body. Whether somebody took pictures of a different body that was altered in order to make it and claimed that those were Kennedy autopsy photos. I've never known what to make of those photos. They're not in the middle of a morgue room. They're off in some corner next to a wall. I mean, it's a very strange sequence there, And as far as I know, after the autopsy was over, he was taken and worked on by Farrell Funeral Home, prepared for the casket. And so I don't. There's something the matter with what happens, but at the very least that the autopsy was controlled and that certain bullets were not examined and that Hume burned the autopsy notes, the original notes, and everything after that is based on descriptions given to people who weren't there to draw drawings and things like that. So, and it wasn't a real autopsy. They didn't do cardinal points. They didn't section the brain, or if they did section the brain, that's all destroyed. They took a lot more photos and x-rays than have ever been released. So, but Lifton was kind of contentious with other people also, and I've invited him to Copa. I can't remember if he came to Spogie Lancer a couple of times.
So he's contentious within to other researchers?
Yeah, to other researchers within the community. And then he's said for years he's doing a book on Oswald, but as far as we know, I don't even know if it'll ever come out. It's just been a thing for like 20 years. People said he's writing this book. But, I mean, you know, he puts forward his thesis and you analyze it and you take it for what it's worth. I mean, every book has information in it, even if it's written by your opponent. They got to base it on something. And you can do your own evaluation of what the something is if it's documented. Harold Weisberg was a Senate investigator, I believe, and had a background in doing investigation, and felt that they had really flawed the investigation. And he did his own work, but he wrote...
Yeah, can you repeat that?
Start from the top.
Harold Weisberg, I think, had been a Senate investigator and had investigative skills, but felt that the Warren Commission, when it was released and he looked at it, was a really botched job, that they'd done a really flawed investigation. And he was an early critic. They wrote Whitewash. He was a very obtuse writer. He's not an easy read. You don't have to get in your canoe and slog for a while. And he never had an editor for any of his books, as far as I know. I don't even know if he was allowed one. He was cantankerous, and I went to see him one time, and only once, while he was still alive. We gave him one of the awards, but posthumously. But he was in the end of the same conclusion that I was at this, and it's in his final book, Never Again, that the Joint Chiefs was really what was behind the assassination and where you had to look. And when I mentioned something to him about a Air Force officer who'd been in covert operations that I had spoken to in Atlanta at one point, who acknowledged to me that the military had killed Kennedy, he took out a tape recorder and wanted to get a taped version of what I was saying, and so he clearly had an interest in that direction. But he was often at odds. Also generous with his stuff. Even Posner was allowed to go in and go through all of his stuff, posing as someone interested at the time and then using it against him. And he slams Posner in Case Open, But he wasn't an easy guy to get along with. I guess that's the simplest way to say it. And he was critical of a lot of the other researchers, and even Garrison, I think, and Sylvia Moore, I think, was critical of Garrison, and there was a strain there, across things. Mae Brussell went to help him. Mae was just she was little known except among the researchers themselves, but she probably worked harder than any of them. By the time I got to her collection when she was dying, she had about 6,000 books. She had 43 filing cabinets, 4-drawer filing cabinets, like the ones in this room, that were filled with her clippings. She would clip 15 papers, and on one particular article she might write 5 categories, and then she'd make 4 extra copies of it and put it in each one of the filings. She told me she didn't like computers. I said, that's because you are the computer. And she was just an amazing energy flowed through her. I used to keep a picture of her on my wall when I was doing the veterans work in the 70s, just to inspire me to keep going. On a day when you get overloaded, if you can't go on, I'd look at a picture of Mae and say, okay. And she had a great sense of humor too, and when I would call her with some new thing, I said, Mae, did you see this? Because we'd swap articles and books, and she'd say, oh, my aching ass. And And here we'd be talking about the most morbid possible subjects and laughing our heads off, because what else can you do? I mean, like, it's so absurd the way they lie and the way they cover up, and it's just almost unbelievable. But we got along from the first, and we're friends and collaborators in the work, and shared materials. But she would go to public talks, and people would come up after the talk and say, "Oh, Mae, I really love what you do, and you do such great work, and I'm really glad that you're doing it." And she would turn and say, "And what do you do?" Because she started her weekly radio show was called World Watchers, and she started it based on Weight Watchers, and she thought that there would be little cliques of housewives who would clip the papers and talk about things and coffee clatch, and then send her materials of what they were seeing in their city, and keep them all connected with her, her tapes and things like that. So that was her model, and why she called it World Watchers. And I got the first group of people to listen to her tapes every week, because she started sending them out with a sheet, and I would reproduce the sheet, and I had about 10 people who would meet, and every time she put out a radio show, we would, take an hour and a half or whatever it was, and then talk afterwards. And that's a group I call Brussels sprouts. And so she said, "Well, you get the fishing prize." She said, "Because nobody else has caught this many fish to listen to me." But we had a good time with that. And, she was always on the cutting edge. She said that Reagan would be in the White House 10 years before he got there, and everybody thought she was nuts. But she knew these people, and she could see through them, and she could see where they went. And she started to delve into the Nazi connections, and the White Russian connections, and the intelligence connections in the case. And then later murders, not only of the witnesses, but of social figures. And she had done a lot of work about people like Jim Morrison or Janis Joplin, that she felt were murdered because they were part of the counterculture and the Big Sur. And she saw the murders as part of a pattern that happened in Weimar Republic in Germany from 1928 to 32. A guy named Gumbel wrote a book about 400 political murders, 400 war murders, he called them. And the Freikorps, reactionary veterans group, was killing off the political opposition, musicians and labor leaders and organizers and communists and people who would, and the academicians who were speaking out and who would have stood in Hitler's way and called the lie to Hitler, were wiped out systematically in 400 unsolved political murders that the Weimar Republic said they knew they were politically motivated, but they couldn't solve who was doing them. And there's a film, Serpent's Egg. It's the only film Ingmar Bergman made in the U.S., and it starts off with one of those murders and then follows the brother of the guy that's murdered. And it's about Serpent's Egg being the nascent fascism about to rise. It's one of his best films. Liv Ullmann and John Carradine. It's not John Carradine, but it's his son was in it. And but she saw a pattern here emerging, especially after the Kennedy assassination, of political murders of the society as a whole, for the purpose of wiping out the opposition that would stand in the way of rising fascism. And she saw fascism not as dead in a bunker in 1945, but continuing into the current period. And she was very gutsy. I remember she thought that this particular guy, and I agreed looking at the photos, Fritz Kramer, who worked in the Pentagon Plans Division for 30 years and was considered the iron mentor to Kissinger, Haig, Lansdale, if you know those names, had been the same as Fritz Gustav Anton Kramer in the dockets at Dachau, number 33, for the Malmedy massacre, who was released by John J. McCloy. And she got a picture of him in the dockets, and then she got the Pentagon to send her under FOIA, send her a picture of the retirement picture of Fritz Kramer, and they looked the same, and she mailed them on to him on Fessenden Street and said, "Is this you?" But she would stand up to them, and call them out, and she was tremendously far ahead of her time. And she went down to help Jim Garrison, and while she was down there, two people posing as friends of her son were actually military intelligence, slipped him some kind of acid that flipped him out so bad that he ended up in a mental institution. And by the time she got home to deal with the crisis, the state of California medical institution had a transfer order to take him to Chestnut Lodge, a private institution that was part of the MK Ultra operation and mind control, where Frank Olson had gone before he was sent to New York and jumped out the window, where Judith Beck-Stein had been taken, who overheard, she said, Nazi doctors talking about killing Kennedy and King at Chestnut Lodge. And she had bought the Post, and she was a liberal, and she said she wanted the Washington Post. She said we wanted one paper in the country to tell the truth about what was happening, race relations and other things. And so she was, after the contract was signed, she was locked up involuntarily in Chestnut Lodge and deemed to be crazy, and the contract was torn up and given instead to Catherine Graham and Philip Graham by Catherine's father. And that's how they got control of the Post, was knocking out Judith Beck-Stein from the Stein and Day publishing company money, but she had her own Beck family money. And she wrote a journal, and last I saw her, she was at the 10th anniversary conference. Didn't speak, but was present, and I went and got her journal and spoke to her a little bit, and then after that I couldn't find her. Don't know if she died or what happened, but it's an important book. But Mae was just out there. She was at the cutting edge. She was seeing things ahead of time and, evaluating things, and I was catching on to things and trying to feed information back to her as it was coming out. And so I've tried to continue in her tradition, though I can't hold a candle to the level of work she did, even though most people think I work more than anybody they know. I don't think I work as hard as Mae Brussell and or get as much done. I'd like to. But she was isolated too, especially by the end, living alone and being threatened, and and Weisberg lived pretty much on his own with this stuff. A lot of marriages have fallen apart because the researchers get too involved. Then there was like the second generation, like Walt Brown did good work and wrote a number of books and did his own index, a more exhaustive index of the commission volumes, and knows the case inside out. And wrote People versus Lee Harvey Oswald, and the War and Omission, and there's a Death in Dallas, or I think, with his own thesis of what happened. So we got the range. And then we had Cyril Wecht, who was head of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences and one of the leading forensic pathologists in the country, who knew the other leading pathologists, like he was close friends with the guy that did the autopsy on Robert Kennedy, who said that the powder burns and markings on the wound that goes in behind his ear had to be from a gun 2 to 3 inches away. Well, Ciron's gun was never anywhere near that. It was feet away and in front of and not behind. So it tells us that there was a second gun. Noguchi was the coroner in that case. Wecht did his own analysis and was called in on a special panel to look at evidence that up to that point had been buried about the autopsy, and came to the conclusion of a second gunman. He worked on other famous cases, and is still in the news, and is now facing 85 federal charges for some sort of local corruption brought by one of the attorneys that was put in place by Gonzalez in this attorney scandal. And he was the first president of Coalition on Political Assassinations. We had other key people working with us. Dr. Herbert McDonald of New York, who's another leading forensic expert, who invented the Ballascan macrograph that takes a rotating picture of two shells, the shell involved in the crime that's taken from the body or the scene, and a shell fired from the gun that they believe to be matching, or maybe matching, testing to see if it matches. They take a bullet, shoot it into cotton, and then they turn them in sequence 360 degrees with a special camera that takes a strip photo in time, and then that strip is blown up and put on a wall, and you can see in great detail the grooves and the markings and the hatch marks on the bullets, and all the different gross and fine characteristics, and you can see in great detail whether or not these are the same bullets, because that's what forensic matching does. You can eliminated down to the particular gun whether that bullet came out of that barrel because of the scratchings and cantilevers and other things. So, and he compared the bullets in Robert Kennedy's body to test shots that the LAPD said came from the gun that Sirhan had, and they don't match. So we've had very well-known historians and forensic scientists and others come forward over the years. The early critics were just critics. I mean, they were just people who had a critical point of view. Some were lawyers, like Lane, but most of them were just individuals who said that something's amiss here, something doesn't fit. And I did my own work, but more for myself initially, that I just wanted to know what happened. And I read through the 26 volumes and compared it to the report and read a lot of the early critics and followed the case, and then began to meet with and correspond with people like Mae Brussell, who was a mentor to me, and Penn Jones and some of the independent critics of the time. Then there was a whole other body of critics that I couldn't figure out what they were or who they were working for. But Fensterwald had this thing called the Committee to Investigate Assassinations, CTIA, and I wrote him a note and said in a mnemonics you don't give initially, that I just wanted to know what happened. And I read through the 26 volumes and compared it to the report and read a lot of the early critics and followed the case, and then began to meet with and correspond with people like Mae Brussell, who was a mentor to me, and Penn Jones and some of the independent critics of the time. Then there was a whole other body of critics that I couldn't figure out what they were or who they were working for. But Fensterwald had this thing called the Committee to Investigate Assassinations, CTIA, and I wrote him a note and said in a mnemonics you don't give a letter to the pronoun. The two doesn't get a letter. I found his name on. My parents had been to the Kennedy inauguration and kept the program, and his name, he was the chair of the inauguration. So I think he was close to the Kennedy family, and maybe was asked by them to sort of scratch around and see what he could find out about what people knew of the assassination. But he often came off as somebody that he was doing something else. Nobody could, he wasn't generous, he wasn't open all the time. He was just kind of, and I went to his office one time in D.C. and it was basically a shell. It was empty file drawers and empty desks. And I didn't know what to make of that. So I don't know if he just didn't have any papers there, didn't want to have any papers there. I don't know, but it just seems strange to me that you'd have an office without anything in it. And I followed their work, and I sat through Lazar, who now heads the Assassination Archive and Research Center, based on the collection that Fensterwald started to put together. And Fensterwald did an appeal for James O. Ray in the Sixth Circuit. I was there during the appeal. So I've tried to be up close to things as much as possible, and I've also tried to pull the research community together in these conferences. But there are Howard Rothman, he's an almost unknown researcher that did an excellent book called Presumed Guilty. He was a young kid that started reading the commission volumes, and just sat in his room at night, and that's all he did. He obsessed on them, but he deconstructed the idea that Oswald could possibly have been the assassin, because you can't put him physically on the 6th floor and get him down to where the cops saw him on the 2nd floor. The elevator's in the wrong place. He doesn't come down the stairs, and he deconstructs a lot of the things, kind of like Sylvia Marr does, but he does original thinking about it. And that's probably one of the best books, but it's almost unknown. And his name is almost unknown. I worked with Bill Kelly. I got him going on the stuff. He went to college with me, and I took him to a New York City conference some years ago at NYU Law School. And, he was like 17 years old, and he's meeting Fletcher Prouty, who's a researcher that I tracked over the years that wrote on JFK. I got slammed by Chip Berlay for talking to him because he says the right wing is wooing me. But Prouty never struck me as a racist or an anti-Semite. He struck me as a retired military intelligence guy that kind of like the people I grew up in my neighborhood with. And, he was in a lot of places that were important, and he has some things to say. So I think he's worth talking to. But I first met him when Penn Jones came to the Kennedy gravesite here in D.C. because I went out to this little Howard Johnson's hotel where Penn was staying, and when I got there, Fletcher Prouty was in the room with him. Before that, I didn't know who he was. Then he started writing in gallery. And a lot of these guys couldn't get printed anywhere else. They would print in the Flesh magazines. And so there was a store in Philly, probably illegally, but there was a little magazine store in Philly. In the very back room, they would tear the covers off of all of those, Playboy and Gallery, and sell them for 50 cents. And so I used to, because I couldn't afford, $4.50 or $5, and I wasn't interested in the porn. Those weren't magazines that I read. But for 50 cents, I could get, 3 articles about the Kennedy assassination, and toss the rest. So, but that's where I first started seeing Prouty's work. And then, of course, he was Mr. X, or at least part of the Mr. X character in Stone's film.
And we are back. I'm St. Patrick. This is the Midnight Rider News Show, and that's where the first DVD ends. So we're going to move on to the second DVD with Randy Benson interviewing John Judge. Now, this is once again is from the Searchers box set, which you can get at thesearchersfilm.com. That's thesearchersfilm.com. So without further ado, here's Randy and John.
Initially, that I just wanted to know what happened, and I read through the 26 volumes and compared it to the report and read a lot of the early critics and followed the case, and then began to meet with and correspond with people like Mae Brussell, who was a mentor to me, and Penn Jones and some of the independent critics of the time. Then there was a whole other body of critics that I couldn't figure out what they were or who they were working for. But Fensterwald had this thing called the Committee to Investigate Assassinations, CTIA, and I wrote him a note and said in a mnemonics you don't give a letter to the pronoun. The to doesn't get a letter. And I found his name on. My parents had been to the Kennedy inauguration and kept the program, and his name. He was the chair of their inauguration. So I think he was close to the Kennedy family, and maybe was asked by them to sort of scratch around and see what he could find out about what people knew of the assassination. But he often came off as somebody that wasn't. He was doing something else. Nobody could. He wasn't generous. He wasn't open all the time. It was just kind of. And I went to his office one time in D.C. and it was basically a shell. It was empty file drawers and empty desks. And I didn't know what to make of that. So I don't know. He just didn't have any papers there. He didn't want to have any papers there. I don't know, but it just seems strange to me that you'd have an office without anything in it. And and I followed their work, and I sat through Lazar, who now heads the Assassination Archive and Research Center, based on the collection that Fensterwald started to put together. And Fensterwald did an appeal for James Earl Ray in the Sixth Circuit. I was there during the appeal. So I've tried to be up close to things as much as possible, and I've also tried to pull the research community together in these conferences. But there are Howard Rothman. He's an almost unknown researcher that did an excellent book called Presumed Guilty. He was a young kid that started reading the commission volumes, and just sat in his room at night, and that's all he did. He obsessed on them, but he deconstructed the idea that Oswald could possibly have been the assassin, because you can't put him physically on the 6th floor and get him down to where the cops saw him on the 2nd floor. The elevator's in the wrong place. He doesn't come down the stairs, and he deconstructs a lot of the things, kind of like Sylvia Marr does, but he does original thinking about it. And that's probably one of the best books, but it's almost unknown. And his name is almost unknown. I worked with Bill Kelly. I got him going on the stuff. He went to college with me, and I took him to a New York City conference some years ago at NYU Law School. And, he was like 17 years old, and he's meeting Fletcher Prouty, who's a researcher that I tracked over the years that wrote on JFK. I got slammed by Chip Burley for talking to him because he says the right wing is wooing me. But Prouty never struck me as a racist or an anti-Semite. He struck me as a retired military intelligence guy that kind of like the people I grew up in my neighborhood with. And, he was in a lot of places that were important, and he has some things to say. So I think he's worth talking to. But I first met him when Penn Jones came to the Kennedy gravesite here in D.C. because I went out to this little Howard Johnson's hotel where Penn was staying, and when I got there, Fletcher Prouty was in the room with him. Before that, I didn't know who he was. Then he started writing in gallery. And a lot of these guys couldn't get printed anywhere else. They would print in the Flesh magazines. And so there was a store in Philly, probably illegally, but there was a little magazine store in Philly. In the very back room, they would tear the covers off of all of those, Playboy and Gallery, and sell them for 50 cents. And so I used to, because I couldn't afford, $4.50 or $5, and I wasn't interested in the porn. Those weren't magazines that I read. But for 50 cents, I could get 3 articles about the Kennedy assassination, toss the rest. So, but that's where I first started seeing Prouty's work. And then, of course, he was Mr. X, or at least part of the Mr. X character in Stone's film. And when a local radio commentator, who's pretty well known, Diane Rehm, when JFK came out, she was on the show saying that she took her daughter to the film, but she made sure to go with her because the film mixed fact and fiction, and she wanted her daughter to know the difference. But then she said, "But I never believed the Warren Commission." Well, I grabbed the phone quick, and I called in and said, "I'm glad you said that you never believed the Warren Commission." I said, and I think that Stone's sin was that he added fact to a fictional film. I said, most of these Hollywood propaganda movies don't have a whit of fact in them. I said, so his sin seems to be that he's mixing in fact. I said, but we need more facts. And then the film is, if you've ever seen the script of the film, the book, the JFK movie, it's documented. Each quote, of any actor is based on a actual quote from a document. Hardly anything is made up. Now, he has some poetic license. Prouty corresponded with Garrison. He didn't meet him surreptitiously in D.C. But he said the same thing in the correspondence that he says in the film. That you have to look at who benefits and what's it for, why did they kill him. Mm-hmm. And Prouty was behind the writing of Report from Iron Mountain, which was a sort of considered to be it was posed as if it was an actual document, but it was considered to be a parody. But it basically laid out how the government really works and how they really think about war in the long term and how expendable all of us are. As Sutherland, the actor portraying him, says in the movie, war is the health of the state, Mr. Garrison. So I told her that I knew who Mr. X was, so that led her to ask me to stay on the line, and then Prouty and I got on her show. And then because of that, this guy Sanford Unger, who used to work there, now he works at U.S. Information Agency as the head of the communication department, invited us to be part of a forum called the Eagle Forum that gets put out on C-SPAN, where they evaluate movies and films that are historical, like history and film. So they did an evaluation panel on JFK, and I got to be on that. So it got me some national prominence just because I made a phone call. But I knew it was important that somebody at her level at least questioned the commission report. So, and Stone, I think, had not been really he might have been believed that, but he hadn't been a researching critic. And there are people who popularize it who aren't, like Dick Gregory. He's a great guy, but he doesn't do a lot of his own research and reading. He used to hire a researcher that told him certain things, but he kind of intuitively understands things, and he's a comedian, and he has a good grasp of what's happening and how control systems work. So he speaks to them. So there are people that don't do all the hard work, but they still get the point and get the message across. But to me, you don't want to just be spreading paranoia. That's not the point. The point is to understand and deconstruct how the system works and how it lies, and then, to counter that with a healthier system. And of course, if you're not concentrating power so greatly, then you don't have to kill each other to take it. Right. And one thing that would stop assassinations of heads of state is not to have heads of state. But and to have more egalitarian societies. Well, I don't think all conservatives are fascist killers by any stretch, and there are certainly people to the left who will kill, and there are political assassinations carried out by the left as well. But I wouldn't say it has nothing to do with the right and left, in the sense that I think that the plot to kill Kennedy came primarily out of a right-wing analysis of Kennedy, that the right wing was afraid of him. But the left wing, like Chomsky and to some extent Zinn and Alexander Cockburn, take the point of view as structuralists. Number one, that the president, you don't understand how capitalism works if you think the president is who's in charge. And therefore, worrying about Kennedy being shot just means that you're some sort of starry-eyed Camelot liberal who thinks that your great prince was killed and, the world would have gone all right. I don't paint the Kennedys, in my view, as saints. I think they were moved by history. I think they were moved by popular revolt at the time and large anti-war sentiment, large civil rights movement, but they were moved, which is more than you can say about some of the other presidents since then. And their willingness to move is what gave people hope and gave them a sense of hope, and their willingness to be honest. And so, I think they made mistakes, and I think they had their thinking, but the left looks at them and it says, well, they went into Vietnam, they used napalm, they tried to kill Castro, so they say. I don't think actually they knew about those plots, and when they did find out anything about it, I'm sure they tried to stop it. And that's what's in this new book, Brothers, by Talbot, which is another example of you can have just recent books that redo the history that people, the assumptions that people have. David Talbot's Brothers is very good in terms of what was actually happening inside, especially around their attempts to normalize relations with Cuba. And because if you can, it's a second assassination. First you kill the body, then you assassinate the character. Then it doesn't matter if you killed them, because after all, if they're just killers themselves, what difference does it make? It's sort of like worrying about a mob hit when both sides of the mob are fighting, and you're going to cry over a mob hit or think that it means something when, the general idea is, well, they had it coming. Right? So if you can plant this idea that the Kennedys themselves were just venal assassins, and then they had it coming, so who's to care? And I think that's been one theme of Gus Russo and some of these others fed by. And Russo admits that he got a lot of stuff from Helms and from Colby and from the CIA guys, who paint themselves as innocent lambs who were being forced to go after Castro by the evil Kennedys. But I think that's all bunkum. But you have that theme of the blowback, and even Joan Mellon picks up on it, and that Robert Kennedy couldn't go out open the assassination, and opposed people investigating it, and opposed Garrison because it would have led back to him. That his CIA handlers knew Oswald, and he was involved in these hits on Castro, etc. So that's been an emergent theme in the research community of late. But I think that just you have to really get a grounding, in history, and I think that was the advantage of getting these files loose, was to tie it down in a better way. But refocus me. What do you have?
Well, actually, you're bringing me right back to where I wanted to go. Can you talk about the files in
6:19, 6:20? What time's your appointment?
It's 7:30, but I can leave here by like 7:15 and get there. So.
The files.
Okay.
What actually came out? Like specifically, what was released? I mean, we all know that a lot of stuff was released, but just to someone who has no idea about the files, can you talk a little bit about those?
Well, the Warren Commission files were locked up for 75 years on a presidential order by Lyndon Johnson, outside of the ones that had been released either to the archive. There were a few there, and the ones that were in the 26 volumes. The House Select Committee reopened some of that stuff on Kennedy and on King, but Stokes, their chairman, locked those up under a congressional rule for 50 years. So the first is 63 plus 75, like what's that, 2038? and the other is 78 to, I think, 2028 was what it was. So you have we still wouldn't have them at this point. But the Records Act actually went in with an independent board, and so the agencies weren't in charge of what to release any longer. The independent board was. It truncated the number of reasons why you wouldn't release it. In other words, you'd have to be actually compromising an existing operation or source or method or individual or a private agreement between a country and an individual in the government. Otherwise, you had to release it. And the presumption was of release. And so way many more records were released. And when they got initial flap from the agencies, they created categories of records and fought for those. And it was supposed to have been decided by the president, but Clinton sat on it and basically said, you boys work it out. And then eventually the CIA caved. The DIA didn't give as many records, and in their final report they say that certain agencies cooperated, others didn't, others dragged their feet till they went out of existence. Certain records were destroyed. The Secret Service destroyed records for the Miami trip, and technically that was illegal under the Act. Any record, once the Act was passed, nothing was to be destroyed, and the records were just to be transferred over and then evaluated. And if they had to redact a little part, they even had a possibility of them writing a summary of what was in it that was relevant to the case without naming all the names. In other words, that they would put a substitute paragraph. Or they would just redact as little as they had to. So very little of it is redacted still. Although there was a joke I remember on Saturday Night Live when the files first opened. They showed a slide film up on the fake news show, and it was a document that was completely redacted, black, except one little hole in the middle, and white, that said Oswald. And the guy said, well, the files were released today, and they proved that Oswald did it alone. So, the only word you can read is Oswald. So, but it was interesting because both some of the people who had been on the commission and the counter-critics, as well as the critics, wanted the files open. And the counter-critics claimed it would back them up. But in fact, it showed a completely different picture. Now, there was a book that was done, interestingly, by Philip Zelikow and Ernst May, who later became key figures in the 9/11 Commission cover-up. And they had been contracted by the CIA to do case studies and other things at Yale and at Harvard, and had a background of spooks around them and doing intelligence work. They were at this Miller Center, which was trying to put itself up as the official repository for all presidential statements. So when the tapes of the Cuban Missile Crisis were released out of the Kennedy Library due to the JFK Act, they went through those tapes and they transcribed them, and they printed transcripts in a book about the Cuban Missile Crisis. But the head of and that has different points where it says unintelligible. But even with that, it was clear from that book that the Kennedy brothers, almost single-handedly, with very little support even from their internal staff, stood up to Curtis LeMay and the other generals who wanted to go into a nuclear war with the Soviet Union. When it came to the confrontation, they said, let's go ahead, it's winnable, we'll have some damages, but we'll survive, the Soviets will be destroyed. And they were pushing for nuclear war. And only John and Bobby, most of the time, I think there was one other staff person that, or cabinet person that went with them on this, but they said, gentlemen, we're not going to have a nuclear war. We're not going to do that. I mean, it's just too costly, it's destructive. And at one point, it's depicted in the film 13 Days, LeMay storms out of the room and says, we have to get rid of those sons of bitches. And then I think they proceed to do so. But by getting these documents out, it repainted a picture of what happened internally. And then the head of the Kennedy Library, who had also listened to the tapes in detail, looked at this book and compared it and said that the parts that they were leaving out as unintelligible were actually the most important political statements in that direction of opposing the nuclear war that the Kennedys took, and that they were not unintelligible at all. And so he said that no scholar or student could rely on the work of these people at the Miller Center who had written this book. Months after, well, actually several years after 9/11, a book came out called Blind Spot by Timothy Naftali. And I'm looking at this because it's about the supposed blind spot and intelligence failure to deal with terrorism. And I open it up, and this guy says, this book was written under contract as part of the 9/11 Commission report. And I was contracted out to write it. And it's the basic theme of the 9/11 Commission. This guy's the intellectual author of the theme, which is that this is all an intelligence failure. And in the preface to his book, with no context for it, one of the things he says is that, there's no such thing as conspiracies. And he says Oswald, acted alone. And he says Oswald knew that this motorcade was going to come through, and so he took the moment to, aggrandize himself. And then he mentions the theory that they knew ahead of time at Pearl Harbor, and he cites one book to say that that isn't true, even though the preponderance of evidence is that they did know ahead of time. So he discounts conspiracy theories. He says what he's seen in government is that things happen due to incompetence. And so he's already wielding an axe that he doesn't have to wield in this book. But then I go to the back to look at the flap to see what his background is, and guess where he works? He works at the Miller Center, and his job is the head of all the recordings and tape session and the transcriptions that are done on the tapes. So he's the guy that actually jumbles up the tapes that are then put out in this book, and the three of them are complicit in the 9/11 cover-up out of this Miller Center down in University of Virginia. So you get people crossing over, in the cover-ups like this, and people with intelligence backgrounds that do these things. But the real tapes and the real evidence shows that the Kennedys were taking a different path, that they were trying to move toward world peace. They stood firm on the nuclear weapons issue, but they weren't going to go to war about it. It shows that in the that's at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. It shows that at the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy clearly was not going to use military invasion and told them that in advance. And really, I think that what they did is they set up a project that was meant to fail and meant to then tip Kennedy's hand to say, like, well, you can't just let all these guys die there on the beach. You've got to give them air support. And he said no still. And that's one of the reasons that they were so furious with him, and they couldn't. And again, LeMay was involved. And it was trying to get them to go to war against Castro, and he wouldn't do it.
You mentioned the Northwoods document.
Yeah, the Northwoods document. That was this plan that they had. So I think a lot of that was to get around Jack and Bobby, and I think Lansdale was getting around them behind their back on these plans to kill Castro. Although I think that if you can kill Kennedy, you can kill Castro. I think that if they really wanted to kill Castro, they would have done it. And I think that all this stuff about exploding cigars and poison pens and it just sounds like, they hired Ian Fleming for the weekend to write them a script. I don't think that that's the way they would have tried to kill him with all these exotic tools, or that he was that invulnerable, that they couldn't reach him. I think it was of use to them to have a whipping boy up to a point, although there were others that wanted to throw him over entirely. But I think they would have had that sort of meat cleaver approach, not this. And I think that really what they were doing, the CIA Mafia link that was made, that followed historically from a DIA Mafia link, an ONI Mafia link that dated back to World War II. But the CIA link to organized crime was to develop a domestic assassination capability. And if anybody stumbled across it, they would say, oh, we were just doing that to kill Castro. Marcello was brought in to testify, and Regano, his attorney, says in his book that when he came out of the closed hearings, he asked, what did the select committee want from you? And he said, well, they wanted to know if we had plots to kill Castro. And he said, what did you tell them? And he said, we weren't trying to kill Castro. And I don't think they were. I think they were doing something quite different. But, I think that the Mexico City story has been borne out, and that's in Newman's book in great detail, and shows that it was signed off to the top levels of the CIA that were putting this double down there to pose as Oswald. I think that Jim DiEugenio's book, Destiny Betrayed, and Let Justice Fall by Bill Davey are both good books showing, using the new records and showing that the track that Garrison on was correct, and that what he suspected about Clay Shaw was in fact correct, that he was an agent of the CIA, that there's documentation. There's documentation in there that Priscilla Johnson was a witting agent of the intelligence agencies. A lot of the stuff that we suspected but could never see before. And as I say, nobody's finished with it. So I think that the case is still open, and that the files are still open in the sense that they will continue to reveal secrets to us. But the spin put on at the time, even by the review board itself, was, well, we released all these files, but there's nothing there. But a telling note to me is that the executive director of the review board went by me when I was in their little reading room one time and said, well, you people have time to read all these. So I guess we were the only ones doing the reading. One more time. Thank you, Alan Dulles. So, I don't know on what basis they were doing their releases, but thankfully they released most of the stuff. And there needs still to be a congressional review, I think, of that model and also of the JFK process itself. So, I don't know on what basis they were doing their releases, but thankfully they released most of the stuff. And there needs still to be a congressional review, I think, of that model and also of the JFK process itself. The law required a final congressional review, but it may take the archivist signing off on it and saying that the release is finished, and so far there have been annual releases for the agencies and other things that haven't closed the process, and it's probably better left an open process, although people that have discovered new files that should fall under the definition of a JFK assassination record have gone to the government to get them released, and they're putting them back under the old FOIA standards and letting the agencies decide, and they really shouldn't do that. They should release them under the criteria that the review board had. But we never thought we got the whole universe of files, and I can remember one point a bunch of files had come out early on, and Al Navis, a researcher up in Canada, Tony Sento's a friend of his that's done a lot. There's so many, when we're talking about the well-known names, but there's so many exhaustive researchers that I tried to pull together into COPA, that are not known, and that have done. Tony Sento has a 400 or plus slideshow on the Kennedy assassination and does these hours-long presentations. Ed Tatro, who I had speak recently, has been an indefatigable researcher and looking into the LBJ angle. John Gooch down in Florida, or this guy that's been writing Mary Ferry and the monkey virus, and he has a new book out about Mary Sherman and the experiments of David Ferry, and we're doing it LSU, and I don't think that they're all infallible, but they are local and specific researchers. Bill Kelly does a lot of that, follows down particular leads. He's been tracking more recently, I think, one of the guys that was riding around with Oswald in Mexico City on a motorcycle. But they get a name, and they do work to track it, and they try to find witnesses that are still living, and there's groundbreaking work still being done. I just mentioned Manning Marable doing this book on Malcolm, and he's interviewed all these witnesses to the assassination that nobody's ever even talked to, and found forensic reports and police reports, and so it's a matter of taking the time and having the interest to do the investigation that the government has never done. The government doesn't investigate these cases. They don't talk to the witnesses, or if they do, they bully them and tell them to shut up, or they ignore the key witnesses, and twist the thing the other way. And so it's sort of an anti-investigation when they get into these matters. But a lot of it is still being done out there by the, by the independent people. But I Anyway, Al Navis was asked, well, what percentage of the files do you think have been released? And he said, I don't know, about 10%. And they said, well, where are the rest? He said, the ink's still drying. But, and that's the other saving grace, I think, for the better researchers. You have a sense of humor about this, because if you don't, I think he just wouldn't survive it, and a skepticism. But there have been, sitting behind me here are 2 full bookshelves, 6 foot high, of just the books that I have on, and sometimes double shelved, on the various political assassinations that I've collected over the years. And then it's not exhaustive, but it's exhaustive of the ones that I think are the best. But I keep hearing of new ones, Crime of the Century by Michael Kurtz that I haven't seen yet and would want to get, And then there's books that are more interesting to me now relating to the period leading up to it. And at one point I said to Mae Brussell, you know what we should do, Mae? I said we should go to November 22nd, 1963 and start clipping backwards. I said, we've been clipping forwards all these years. I said, if we clip backwards, now that we know everybody that's involved and we know the basic outline of the plot, let's go backwards in time, because they weren't covering their rear end as well then. They weren't expecting we'd be looking at them. And I often find that if I can get an obituary of somebody, it'll tell me far more than I can ever find out in the papers about them during their lives. And going back in time that way, I think tells you volumes, and you don't get it otherwise. So the historical books about the Kennedy administration, or the things leading up into it, are more valuable to me sometimes now than the critique of the event. And part of that is because I'm not still like, we'll never know. I think I know pretty well what happened, and that it was, I've got other independent evidence that I garnered that it was a military coup. But I have my reasons that I think that. But I did it both on original research and on printed material. But most of the books don't go that way. If somebody said, "Can you tell me a book that that both debunks the report and gives you a solid conclusion?" I'd say it hasn't been written yet. At least one that would be definitive for me. There's a few that come close to it, but Peter Del Scott, I guess, is the closest. But
tell me real quick about the what deep politics was the.
Deep politics was his term, or parapolitics before that. This idea that there's an overworld and an underworld operating, and that they sometimes merge and congeal and sometimes split apart, right. That there are factions in it, and that you have to look at sort of the milieu, I guess is what you'd call it, of characters and forces in play at the given time in order to understand what's happening, as well as the government planning and other things. So like in Road to 9/11, he's looking at continuity of government. He's looking at development of the sort of split in the class from the time of the Kennedy assassination forward, who was who and who's sort of fighting who, the rise of the neocons. But at the same time, all this underworld of these big drug dealers, covert operations, spies, corporate interlocks. Reality's complex. And but I think only by having all of those put together at once does a real picture start to emerge of any given thing. So, you have to know Kennedy's politics. But, I was starting to say earlier, the left evaluates Kennedy from their perspective and says, well, he wasn't worth killing. He was just going along with the system and maintaining everything, and he's only the president and he doesn't run things, so why would they bother killing him? And they kind of stick their leftist nose up in the air because he's not pure enough in their left view of the world to be worth the bullet. But my response to that is, you can't evaluate him in terms of what the left thought of him. You have to evaluate him in terms of what the right thought of him. The left didn't kill him, the right did. Okay? So what the right wing thinks about him does make a difference. And why they would see him as a threat makes a difference, even if you don't think he's enough of a threat, or he's not, as radical as you are. It doesn't take a lot for some of these Neanderthals to consider you a radical or a traitor or a betrayer. They're short trigger, they're kind of McCarthy mentality. They're not sophisticated or nuanced. Either you're doing what they want you to or you're not. And, if they want to show their power, they're going to do that. So I think, in that sense, it has to do with the right and the left, but I don't think more than that, although there are right-wing analyses and critiques of the assassination that I think are bogus, that I think are, like the Piper thing I mentioned earlier, that I wouldn't put forward. But I'm not just studying Camelot.
Sure.
I mean, and one of the things I said was to some people who told me that Chomsky was always dismissing the Kennedy assassination, and I actually there's text now in a book called Understanding Power by Chomsky. It's text of his question and answer sessions. Mm-hmm. And so I went to that and went to the index right away and looked up Kennedy assassination. And he says that everything's a conspiracy. If your faculty group meets to plan a new curriculum, that's a conspiracy. If your group of scientists at General Motors plans a new car body, that's a conspiracy. So conspiracies are meaningless, he says. Then he turns around and says that some conspiracies do happen that are illegal, but the system hates them and they crush them right away, like Contragate. Well, that's an interesting interpretation of Contragate. I think of these scandals as splits between the class, one spilling the beans on the other for their own advantage, but that's his take on that. Then he says that all these people spent all this time looking in detail at the Kennedy assassination. He says there's nothing there. Now, I actually found an early, Mark Lane had this thing called the Citizens Commission of Inquiry, and they were calling for an reinvestigation, and reopening of the Kennedy case. And they had all these signatories in an ad in the New York Times, and Chomsky signed it in the 60s. But then here he is now saying there's nothing there. There's nothing to look at. Forget it. It's a waste of time. It's destroying the left. I don't know what effect we have on the left. We're pretty isolated as far as I can tell, and dismissed. So how are we destroying the left? And then he says that there have been political assassinations or attempts at assassinations, in history, like the attempt to kill Hitler, that might be interesting, for a historical monograph, but they're just blips on the record, and they don't really mean anything. You can't interpret anything from them. And so it might be a little historical monograph you want for detail, but it doesn't mean anything. Well, Bill Kelly got a laugh out of that because he had tracked the planners and the plotters of the main attempt against Hitler. Hugo Grotius, who was spirited out of the country by Mary Bancroft, who was the mistress for Allen Dulles, and 5 other people involved in the plot who eventually fold into the Kennedy assassination circles later. So there's direct connections to the assassination, but according to Chomsky, it's just a meaningless little historical. But I always told people, well, ask Chomsky and these guys who deny the Kennedy assassination could have meant anything. Ask them about the King assassination. So someone does in the same sequence. They say, well, you say that Kennedy's no good. What about King? Oh, well, King, he said that was a conspiracy that involved organized crime and involved the intelligence agencies and probably went up to the top levels of the government. So now Chomsky's like a conspiracy theorist all of a sudden. There are conspiracies. And then he says, basically, that King was worth killing, that they had a reason to kill King. So then the bottom line is whether you like the guy or not. You think he's worth killing or he's not, then if they kill him, it's a conspiracy, and if the other guy it isn't because you wouldn't have killed him. So what's the point? I mean, and then the other thing he said, which was ridiculous, he said, like, you've got all these people looking at the Kennedy assassination, and none of them are looking at the Martin Luther King assassination. And he's trying to say that they're racist. Well, the first crossover was Harold Weisberg. Harold Weisberg wrote Frame Up, and a whole book on that assassination. Mark Lane and Dick Gregory did, what became Murder in Memphis, originally called Codename Zorro. On the King assassination, and other people wrote on King, and a lot of the research community, and we've always featured King and John and Robert, Malcolm, in our work at COPA. We don't make those distinctions because it turns out that a lot of the same people and the same methods follow through. So they're not meaningless. And in terms of right and left, the other thing I was going to say was I did exhaustive work on the Reagan shooting. Most people, they don't like Reagan. They're probably glad he shot, but I know that it means something when they try to kill the president. And when I see the same pattern of the black box being taken away and the coup aspects and Haig coming saying I'm in charge here until the vice president returns, and I know it means something. So I went into detail about it in the same way that I did on the others. Not because I love Reagan or love Kennedy. because these are politics that involve the nation. And when a local radio commentator, who's pretty well known, Diane Rehm, when JFK came out, she was on the show saying that she took her daughter to the film, but she made sure to go with her because the film mixed fact and fiction, and she wanted her daughter to know the difference. But then she said, "But I never believed the Warren Commission." Well, I grabbed the phone quick, and I called in and said, "I'm glad you said that you never believed the Warren Commission." I said, and I think that Stone's sin was that he added fact to a fictional film. I said, most of these Hollywood propaganda movies don't have a whit of fact in them. I said, so his sin seems to be that he's mixing in fact. I said, but we need more facts. And the film is, if you've ever seen the script of the film, the book, the JFK movie, it's documented. Each quote, of any actor is based on a actual quote from a document. Hardly anything is made up. Now, he has some poetic license. Prouty corresponded with Garrison. He didn't meet him surreptitiously in D.C. But he said the same thing in the correspondence that he says in the film. That you have to look at who benefits and what's it for. Why did they kill him? Mm-hmm. And Prouty was behind the writing of Report from Iron Mountain, which was a sort of considered to be it was posed as if it was an actual document, but it was considered to be a parody. But it basically laid out how the government really works and how they really think about war in the long term and how expendable all of us are. As Sutherland, the actor portraying him, says in the movie, war is the health of the state, Mr. Garrison. So I told her that I knew who Mr. X was, so that led her to ask me to stay on the line, and then Prouty and I got on her show. And then because of that, this guy Sanford Unger, who used to work there, now he works at U.S. Information Agency as the head of the communication department, invited us to be part of a forum called the Eagle Forum that gets put out on C-SPAN, where they evaluate movies and films that are historical, like history and film. So they did an evaluation panel on JFK, and I got to be on that. So it got me some national prominence just because I made a phone call. But I knew it was important that somebody at her level at least questioned the commission report. So, and Stone, I think, had not been really he might have been believed that, but he hadn't been a researching critic. And there are people who popularize it who aren't, like Dick Gregory. He's a great guy, but he doesn't do a lot of his own research and reading. He used to hire a researcher that told him certain things, but he kind of intuitively understands things, and he's a comedian, and he has a good grasp of what's happening and how control systems work. So he speaks to them. So there are people that don't do all the hard work, but they still get the point and get the message across. But to me, you don't want to just be spreading paranoia. That's not the point. The point is to understand and deconstruct how the system works and how it lies, and then, to counter that with a healthier system. And of course, if you're not concentrating power so greatly, then you don't have to kill each other to take it. Right. And one thing that would stop assassinations of heads of state is not to have heads of state. But and to have more egalitarian societies.
And that was Randy Benson and John Judge, and I want to thank Randy again for the use of the audio. So if you want to get the full box set, which you should absolutely do, just go to thesearchersfilm.com. That's thesearchersfilm.com, and do so there. I want to thank everyone so much for joining us for the third installment of the Midnight Rider News Legends series. Now you're going to get the fourth installment later this month, and you are going to love that one. Trust me on that. So, from the other side of the mountain, on the best side of midnight, I wish you peace.
You can contact St. Patrick by email at midnightridernews@gmail.com. Join us on Facebook at Midnight Rider News Show. Follow St. Patrick on Twitter at MWN_St. Patrick. We are LinkedIn at S.T.Patrick. And don't forget to follow Midnight Rider News on your YouTube, iTunes, Stitcher Radio, and many of your favorite podcast providers. This has been a production of MidnightRiderNews.com and St. Patrick. copyright 2018. All rights reserved. We'll see you next time, and be good to the night.